Welcome back to Warhammer Beef Broganoffs. We got a desperate Lucius Eternal making a deadly deal with the Clone Father. Before we get into that, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and always check out the merch below. Now, let's get into the video.
The world had no name that mattered. It burned beneath a low, poisoned sky. Hive spires split and gutted. Manufactoria smelting only smoke and ash. Vox towers howled with overlapping distress calls. The panicked cant of the administratum, drowning in its own data. Column after column of the Astra Militarum had already been broken on the anvil of invasion. Armor lay overturned in cratered streets, treads still spinning on empty air, hulls peeled open by melter fire and chain-blade teeth. The corpse god's banners hung in tatters, soaked dark where they had fallen among the dying. Lucius walked through it all with his helm open to taste the air. The reek of burned propellant and scorched meat clung to every breath, cloying and rich. He drew it in through scarred lips and smiled without humor as a line of world soldiers broke ahead of him. They had dug in among the shattered carcasses of a regiment's transport, sandbag walls and hastily raised barricades turning the avenue into a killing field. Lasbolts flashed in tight, disciplined strings, their fire pattering from his plate in a stuttering halo of red sparks. Behind him, the remnants of the cohorse Nazicae advanced with far less discipline than the mortals facing them, and far more grace. Emperor's children in armor that had once shone with the pale perfection of the Third Legion, now repainted, re-etched, bedecked in trophies and scars. Their formations were loose, stretched thin, each brother spaced where once there had been three. Broken helms hung at their belts. Chains of badges and rank medallions jingled softly with every step. "Advance," Lucius voxed, though none of them had slowed. His voice carried the easy command of long practice, the lazy cruelty of one who knew that none among them could challenge him and survive. Bolters boomed. The killing field vanished in a blossom of smoke and pulverized mortar. Mortals burst apart where the mass reactive shells found them, flung backwards over. Their own barricade, armor crumpling, limbs bent at angles, no joint was made to take. Those not torn down outright were shredded by flying shards of ferrocrete, tossed screaming into the dirt. Lucius ignored their fire. He walked at a measured pace, his sword held low and close, a duelist's blade of perfect proportion. Where Lasbolt struck his armor, he felt only a faint tingling, each failing beam a tiny insult to the legacy encoded in his bones. A missile screamed in from the flank, smoke trail cutting a dirty line through the air. It struck one of his brothers head-on, detonating in a burst of light and thunder. When the vapor cleared, there was nothing left of the cohor's warrior but a burning ruin and a smear of ceramite. Lucius did not look back. The line shattered as he closed. One world soldier dropped weapon and ran. Another stood frozen, laser gun spasming useless flashes into the sky as the faultless blade came up. Lucius stepped in, twisted his body, and let the movement carry the weapon through its arc. Man and gun parted. He barely felt the resistance. He moved like a dancer among stumbling, shrieking men, each stroke economical, each parry almost contemptuous. A bayonet jabbed clumsily for his throat, guided by a mortal's desperate courage. Lucius turned his head, let the blade screech along his gorget, sidestepped, and opened the man from shoulder to hip. The soldier fell, hands pressed to a rent in his body, as if that could hold in whatever remained of his life. "Sloppy," Lucius murmured, stepping past him. "You die sloppy." A bolt round hit him square in the pauldron, rocking his stance. The armor held, though the impact bruised. He turned his head to see its source, and found not more mortals, but the advancing shape of a space marine in loyalist colors, striding through smoke with his own warriors at his back. They wore the livery of a chapter Lucius did not recognize. The Imperium had spawned so many, each eager to claim they were inheritors of the First Legions, while knowing nothing of the truth, nothing of the perfection that had once been wrought in marble and gold. Their heraldry was a snarling beast of some kind, fanged maw picked out on the pauldron. Their armor was clean despite the battle raging around them, lenses bright, ceramite unmarred by indulgent decoration. At their head, a champion carried a long-bladed sword not unlike Lucius's own. His helm was plumed, his chest plate marked with purity seals and waxen prayers. The blows he dealt as he crashed into Lucius's warriors were measured and efficient, each cut placed with surety. Cohor's Nasicae brothers fell before him, their armor split, their bodies driven to the ground. Lucius felt a thrill. At last, amid all this frantic ugliness, a blade that might dance with his. He raised his sword in salute. "Come then," he called, letting the external vox carry his voice over the battlefield din. "Show me the best the corpse Emperor can throw away on a nameless world." The loyalist answered with a burst of speed that belied the weight of his plate. Their blades met in a shriek of metal on metal. The shock transmitted up Lucius's arm. There was strength in that strike and conviction. The champion pressed the attack, a storm of cuts and thrusts, each aimed at a gap in the armor, at a weak point. Lucius yielded ground for a moment, laughing as he parried, the clash of their swords ringing out like a hymn. "Better," he said. "Much better." The loyalist did not waste breath in reply. He lunged, seeking Lucius's heart, his stance picture perfect, weight behind the strike. Lucius stepped aside by the breadth of a finger, twisted, and let the blade pass. In the same motion, he brought his own weapon around in a riposte, edge catching the champion just below the elbow. The arm came away entirely. The loyalist staggered, blood hissing across painted ceramite, the severed limb tumbling to the ground, still clutching its sword. Lucius spun the faultless blade and reversed his grip, driving the point up beneath the other warrior's breastplate gorget. The champion convulsed once, helm jerking, purity seals tearing free. Lucius held him there for a heartbeat, close enough that their helms almost touched, as if in intimacy. "You were worthy of better masters," he said softly. He wrenched the blade free and let the body fall. Around them, the fight had turned to rout. The last of the world's soldiers fled between burning habs, chased down by Cohor's Nasicae brothers, who fired into their backs more out of habit than need. Loyalist Astartes lay broken where they had stood, their chapter's colors sullied, their genocide bleeding out into the mud of a world that would never know their names. Lucius looked about him. He counted quickly, out of long habit. Once, the Cohor's Nasicae had been a full company, the pride of the 3rd Legion, its ranks filled with warriors whose names had been spoken in the same breath as Primarchs. Now he saw only a few score figures moving through the smoke, most limping or clutching at cracked plate, helms hanging at their sides where targeting relays had died. Another brother fell, armor giving way as a lucky lasbolt found a weak seam. He twitched on the ground. No one went to him. There was no apothecary to harvest what remained, no fleshsmith to patch him together. His death was as final as any mortal's. Lucius turned away from the sight and cleaned his blade with a flick that sent droplets pattering onto the already spoiled ground. "Enough," he voxed. "Break their command bastion, silence their vox, take what spoils amuse you. We depart when the last gun falls quiet." His warriors answered with static, laughter, and broken shards of binaric prayer. They scattered into the ruins like wolves set loose among wounded prey. Where they walked, screams followed. The command bastion fell in time, brought down by melter charges and sheer determination. Mortals died in droves, some fighting, some begging, some choking on the smoke of their own burning archives. Lucius watched listlessly as his champions set up crude shrines amid the ruins, draping broken banners over statues, painting the sigils of the Prince of Excess over imperial eagles. They dragged trembling prisoners into circles of light, forcing them to dance, to fight, to abase themselves in ways that might once have brought Lucius a flicker of amusement. Now he felt only a dull ache. The pitch of his armor's internal chorus had changed. The souls bound into it shrieked, not with jubilant bloodlust, but with something like hunger. Later, when the sky had darkened further with the ash plume of the dying hive and the last Vox tower had fallen silent, Cohors Nasicae gathered in what had once been a chapel to the emperor. The altar lay on its side. The saint's statue had been toppled and defaced, its marble visage carved into a mask of rapture and agony under the knives of Slaaneshi iconoclasts. Incense burned, thick and cloying, mixing with the sense of spilled wine and spilled life. Warriors lounged among heaps of bodies, their armor open, their skin slick with sweat and the remnants of their excesses. Some had taken mortal thralls and decorated them with flensing knives before they tired of the game and left them to stillness. Others sat alone, staring into nothing, stirring cups of blood wine without drinking. "We have bled this world dry," one champion said, leaning back against the broken altar, his voice slurred with intoxication. Helm off, face a ruin of scar tissue. "We should linger, take our time. There is art yet to be made here." "We have taken their munitions," another countered. "Such as they were, their storehouses were as poor as their faith. Our ship's magazines still run thin. Our armor still cracks in the same places. We are carrion crows, not eagles." "Mind your tongue, Vardas," a third snarled. "We are the sons of Fulgrim. We are never carrion." Lucius listened from the shadows, hands resting lightly on the pommel of his sheathed sword. The arguments washed over him. For all their indulgence, his warriors were not blind. They could see the truth written in the tally of ammunition, in the damage logs of their warship, in the empty racks where once reserve armor and spare helms had hung. Eventually, he left them to their squabbling and returned to the waiting strike craft. The flagship of the Cohors Nasicae hung in low orbit, a wounded predator circling over its dying kill. Once she had been a marvel of the Third Legion's artisan shipwrights, her flanks adorned with reliefs and frescoes, her lance batteries etched with scenes of ancient triumph. Now scars marred her hull, ugly plates of scavenged armor covering rents left by torpedoes and macro cannon fire. Whole decks lay dark where generators had failed. The ship's machine, spirit sulked like a beaten animal. Lucius walked her halls alone. The lighting here never found a perfect level. It flickered between too bright and too dim, as if the lumen strips could not decide whether to mimic a surgical theater or a tomb. Corpses of mortal crewmen lay where they had fallen during previous engagements. Some pushed thoughtfully against the walls, others left sprawled as if to decorate the corridors. He stepped over them without slowing. His armor of shrieking souls whispered and cried with every movement. Faces flickered across its plates, wailing in sound no mortal ear could truly hear. Every death he had dealt that had pleased him, every killer who had taken joy in ending him and been consumed by his curse, added another voice. Once the noise had thrilled him. Now, as the warband dwindled, it sounded to him like a chorus mourning its own future. "You knew, did you not?" he said softly, fingers brushing a section of breastplate where the face of a long-dead rival twisted and contorted. "You knew the long war would not be a ladder we climbed forever." The face wailed mutely. He smiled, but there was little mirth in it. He reached the strategium to find his champions already there, gathered around the hololithic display. The image flickered, showing the burning world below, its continents wreathed in storm and flame. The augur runes around the edges of the projection were a blocky pattern of red and amber. Damage indicators from their previous campaigns lingered, never quite purged by the ship's cantankerous spirit. They fell silent as he entered. "You bicker like mortal generals over scraps," Lucius said, mounting the steps to the central dais. "You gnaw bones and argue they are fit meat." "We speak of where to strike next," Vardas answered, standing, pride overcoming caution. "This world is broken. We can no longer draw anything of worth from it. But there are shrine worlds nearby. Black ships pass. Through this subsector, there are richer veins to tap. And with what, exactly? Another champion asked in a low voice. Do we tap them? We have lost brothers on every raid. Our gene seed spoils in their corpses because we have no apothecaries. Our mortal crew cannot replace the dead. Our armorers fashion repairs from the plates of those we kill. Sooner or later, even the slowest whelp of the corpse emperor's kennel will realize we are crippled and hunt us down. Voices rose. Threats were made. Two champions stepped closer to one another, blades already half drawn, snarls rising beneath their helms. Lucius let it build until the first sword came free. Then he moved. The faultless blade cleared its scabbard in a single, ringing motion. By the time the first champion realized his mistake, the weapon had already crossed his chest. He stood there for a heartbeat, as if nothing had happened, then toppled bonelessly to the deck. The second managed to draw entirely and even swing once, a clumsy blow wasted on empty air. Lucius slid aside, caught the man's arm in one hand, and drove his sword up under the gorget. The tip burst from the back of the champion's neck. He made a choking sound, dropping his weapon, fingers clawing at the blade. Lucius twisted and wrenched it free. The body fell beside the first. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Every duel you fight among yourselves costs me more than it gains, Lucius said, voice low. You waste gene stock, as if we still stood in the shadow of the Phoenician with the forges of 1,000 worlds at our backs. We do not. We stand on a rusting knife edge over the abyss. He wiped the blade on the cloak of one of the dead, sheathed it with unhurried care, and looked up, meeting helmed gazes. I will decide when blood is spent for pride. I will decide who dies for art. I am the one who has walked from the perfect halls of Chemos to the darkest pits of the eye, and I alone carry the favor of our Primarch and our patron. Do not make me waste any more of you on teaching this lesson. No one spoke against him. When he left the strategium, the muttering did not resume. Let them think him tyrant, monster, despot. They were not wrong. A warband needed a blade, not a council. He made his way deeper into the ship, toward the place that had once been a chapel to the Emperor, and now served another master. The door had been torn from its hinges and nailed to the ceiling as a kind of mockery. Inside, a crude altar had been fashioned from deck plating and broken consoles. Chains hung from the overhead, some empty, some bearing what remained of mortal offerings. At the back, nailed to a bulkhead shrine of fused icons and corrupted aquilae, the astropath twitched. The man's eyes had been sewn shut long ago. Thorned cables ran from his skull and spine into the machinery of the shrine, binding him to warp antennae and vox relays. His lips moved constantly in a thin murmur. Only when the ship's course changed did his voice rise, cracking, the flavors of the immaterium pouring through his ruined mind. Now, bathed in the lurid glow of malfunctioning lumen strips, he screamed. "Spider!" the astropath howled, head jerking against the nails that pinned it. Spider in the void, web of sinew and metal, all paths strandward, all futures hooked. Knives for legs, syringes for fangs. Cut us, cut us, cut us open and see the shapes inside. Lucius watched him quietly. The shrieks drilled at his skull, but he had endured worse music. Salvation in the scalpel, the astropath raved. Redemption in the knife. Flesh rewoven, warriors grown like crops. You bleed, you bleed, you bleed, and nothing grows back. The spider would grow you new sons, Sword Lord. The spider waits with patience, greater than gods. Who is this spider? One of the mortal cultists whispered nearby, clutching a censer. Lucius knew. He did not need the warp-mad babbling of a half-dead psyker to place the image. He saw a pallid face, its once proud features ravaged by age and corruption. He smelled chemical fumes and the copper tang of blood in 100 apothecarian chambers. He remembered a voice that spoke of primarchs and perfection with the same detached scorn. The primogenitor. The thought coiled in his gut like a living thing. Fabius Bile, who had carved secrets from the genocide of legions. Fabius, who had turned warriors into instruments and instruments into abominations. Fabius, who had once claimed that even chaos could be dissected and understood given enough time and enough screaming flesh. "You think of him," a voice whispered against Lucius's inner ear, breath like silk and razor wire. Not the astropath, but a presence deeper, his patron, ever amused. "You think of the spider. You remember his hands on your bones. You remember what he made you feel." Lucius remembered. He remembered the apothecarian on a warship lost now to time, the smell of antiseptic that could never quite cover the other odors. He remembered lying strapped to a slab while mechadendrites probed and cut, while the primogenitor murmured observations and theories. He remembered pain that had gone beyond simple endurance, pain that had peeled back layers of self until only raw nerve and the echo of laughter remained. He had hated Fabius then, he hated him still. And yet, the warband was dying. That was the truth. For all their skill, for all their devotion to excess, the cohors Nasicae were being eroded by the long war in a way no single duel could ever have threatened. The Imperium had infinite bodies to throw into the furnace. They did not. Every brother lost was irreplaceable. Every armor plate that shattered was another unrepaired fracture in their ability to prosecute war. There was one being in the galaxy who could change that balance. As if summoned by the thought, a heavy tread sounded at the doorway. Lucius turned to see an ancient warrior entering, helm cradled under one arm. His armor was older than most, marked with the elegant scrollwork of a time before the heresy, now pitted by corrosion and scarred by countless engagements. One of his eyes had been replaced with a simple augmetic lens, no ornament, just function. "Lord," the veteran said, bowing his head. His voice was rough, as if seldom used for anything but war cries. "Cassian," Lucius acknowledged. The man had fought under him since the early days, through Istvan and beyond, surviving things that had broken others in body and mind. "You come to add your mutterings to those in the strategium?" Cassian shook his head. "No, Lord. I come to say what the others will not. They are afraid of you in the way serfs fear a storm. They fear you will cut them down if they speak truths you do not wish to hear." Lucius smiled thinly. "And you do not fear that?" "I fear many things," Cassian said. "I have seen too much not to. But I fear extinction more than I fear your temper." He stepped closer, gaze flicking momentarily to the nailed astropath and the shifting shadows on Lucius's armor. "We are dying, Lord. We both know this. The cohors bleeds faster than we can clot. The Imperium does not even know our name, and yet it is killing us simply by existing, by throwing fresh regiments and chapters into our path each time we raid." Lucius did not dismiss him. He did not speak at all, which was answer enough. "There is one," Cassian went on, "who can grow new killers faster than the corpse god can. One who can take the gene seed we still have and turn it into more. Who can patch broken armor, craft new flesh, weld together a warband from the shards of 100 others." "The primogenitor," Lucius said, tasting the title like ash. Cassian inclined his head. "Aye, the spider, the man who made monsters of us all and calls it science." Lucius's hand curled on the hilt of his sword. "I am no supplicant," he said. "I am no failed experiment crawling back to its maker." "No," Cassian agreed. "You are Lucius. You are the faultless blade. That is why he would deal with you and not discard you with the other scraps that cling to his robes. He values things that are unique, and you are very unique indeed, Lord." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "And we have already paid the price for pride. Our numbers, our munitions, our ship. Perhaps it is time to pay a different price. Cassian left then, bowing once more, leaving the question hanging in the incense-choked air. Lucius remained in the shrine for a long time. Eventually, he moved to the front, to the place where an icon had been raised. It had begun life as a statue of the emperor, robed and stern, hand outstretched in benediction. Now its features had been smoothed away, relayered with sculpted marble that suggested forms not meant for mortal comprehension. Extra limbs, eyes half seen, mouths hinted at beneath the stone, every curve double-edged and inviting. He knelt there, not in supplication, but in intimacy. From a rack of ritual blades, he chose one that had once been part of his own armor, a sliver of ceramite honed to monomolecular sharpness, its edge catching the lurid light. He drew it across his face with slow deliberation. The pain was bright and clean. Blood ran hot down his cheek, dripping from his jaw onto the decking below. The armor of shrieking souls responded, the voices rising in pitch, echoing his own hiss of breath. He drew another line, crossing the first, carving a new pattern into scar tissue already thick with old dueling marks. With each cut, he whispered the same words. The cohors Nasicae will rise. We will not fade into the dark, forgotten. I will not allow the legend of the faultless blade to end on a nameless world, choking on ash. I will do what is required. I will make a bargain, but I will not kneel. Blood pattered steadily onto the deck, pooling around his knees. The shrine seemed to lean closer. The twisted icon loomed, marble mouths almost smiling. The spider thinks himself above gods, he murmured. He thinks the long war is a problem to be solved, not a scripture to be lived. Very well, let him try to solve me. He rose, letting the blood dry on his skin, the new scars burning. He cast the blade aside. It clanged against the deck, spinning away into shadow. On the command deck, the mortal helmsman flinched when he arrived, then forced himself still under Lucius's gaze. The navigator, eyes ruined and bandaged in the fashion of his kind, rocked in his harness, muttering half-heard litanies to ward against the warp. "Have you charted us new prey?" the helmsman asked, voice trembling despite his efforts. "Yes," Lucius said. "We go to the Eye. There is a station there, one the Mechanicum never catalogued, a midden heap of dead ships and forgotten wars. The spider roosts there, spinning his little webs." He leaned over the console, letting his shadow fall across the mortal. "Set our course for the Eye of Terror. Prepare to dive as soon as warp engines are ready." The helmsman swallowed. "As you command, Lord." "You do not need to know the name of our destination," Lucius added, his voice soft as poison. "You need only know this. We go to meet a creature who thinks himself our maker. I intend to show him that a blade is not grown in a vat and bent to another's will. It is forged in fire and quenched in blood." He turned away, the laughter of bound souls whispering in his ears. "Blade to scalpel," he said softly to himself as the ship's klaxons began to sound the call to translation. "Let us see which cuts deeper." The ship groaned as it fell through madness. The strike cruiser had once cut the void like a duelist's thrust, engines singing, shields flaring in precise harmony. Now she limped through, the immaterium wounded and spiteful. Her outer hull was crusted with the frozen detritus of countless engagements, plates of alien metal welded over ruptures, scorched sigils of the Third Legion half lost beneath corrosion. Even her warp wake was ragged, leaving torn skeins of unreality that would trouble any sane navigator foolish enough to follow. Within, the corridors shuddered as the Geller field fought to keep the worst of the sea at bay. Voices whispered at bulkheads, shadows stretched and recoiled with each shift of unreality. Parchments bearing wards in the high tongue of Chemos and the low cant of Slanesh fluttered in phantom winds, edges singed where the warp's touch had tested their strength. Lucius walked the central spine as the deck pitched underfoot. one gauntleted hand resting lightly on the rail, the other on the hilt of his sword. He did not stumble. The ship's lurches and tremors were simply another rhythm for him to incorporate, another imperfect beat to be brought under control. Before him, the display hololith at the end of the corridor flickered and reformed. It did not show a map in any mortal sense. The immaterium could not be charted like real space. Instead, ghostly images of sigils and impressions rose and fell. Broken aquilae, screaming eyes, a contorted eight-pointed star, an intricate spider of light whose legs reached across churning currents. The spider's image burned brighter as they drew nearer. "The primogenitor's reputation still stains the warp," the navigator whispered over the vox, his voice thin and dry as old paper. "His name draws things to it, repels others. It is like steering by a wound in reality." "That is why we find him," Lucius said. "Follow the scar." The ship bucked, something vast brushing its Geller field like a tongue testing teeth. Alarm runes flared, then died as the field flared harder. In the lower decks, cultists and mortal crew fell to their knees, clutching charms and muttering panicked prayers to beings that might listen or might feed on them for the temerity. In the command pulpit, Lucius watched as the spider's sigil grew to dominate the hololith. Behind it, faint and sickly, loomed the suggestion of a structure that existed halfway between real space and the sea. A ring of dead starships, perhaps. A carcass of void hulks frozen around a central mass. Threads of something darker laced through it. Lines of force and blood and bone. "Translation," the navigator croaked at last. "Now. Now." Reality folded. For a heartbeat there was only pressure, like a blade poised at the point of contact. Then the ship lurched sideways out of unreality and into the cold dark of interstellar night. The Geller field dropped with a sigh like a dying god. Normal void sensors flared to life, no less blind in their own way than warp auguries. Runes flashed across the displays, feeding data into cogitators that had long ago given up protesting the things. They were forced to comprehend. Ahead, in the dark, the station waited. It was not a construction of logic and geometry. It had grown, been accreted, been sutured together in defiance of any sane architect. Dead starships hung nose to tail, their hulls cabled together with great coils of adamantium and ligament-like conduits. Warped void shields flickered over them like oily skin. Between the vessels, someone had woven a lattice of bone and twisted metal, forming spires and arches whose lines hurt the eye if followed too closely. Bodies floated in the slow halo around it, a graveyard of the unworthy. Some were Astartes, their plate locked in final poses of rage or fear. Others were mortal crew, their faces frozen rictuses, their limbs stiff. They had been left there intentionally, a crust of warning and ornament. Lucius smiled faintly. "Corpse choked indeed," he murmured. The strike cruiser's vox barked a summons from the station. It was not formatted in any recognized Navy cipher, but its meaning was clear enough, carried on a tone of dry amusement and proprietary indulgence. "Draw us closer," Lucius commanded. "Signal that we come as guests, not prey." The helmsman obeyed, hands trembling only slightly on the controls. Thruster flares turned the cruiser's course, bringing it in parallel with a yawning docking collar that had once been a cruiser's launch bay. The surrounding debris field shifted sluggishly as gravitic hooks extended, drawing the visiting vessel into the station's embrace. Boarding clamps clanged home, reverberations shuddering through the cohors Nassicai's wounded ship. The connecting umbilicus extended, mag seals hissing as they locked gangway to gangway. Lucius stood at the head of his chosen retinue in the airlock, helm in place, the faultless blade sheathed at his side. Behind him, his warriors waited in a double rank. They were few, but there was no weakness in the way they held themselves. Each was a killer. who had walked the long war for centuries, with scars to show for it, and madness coiling in his soul. "You know who we go to meet," Lucius said over the private channel. "You know what he has made and unmade. You will not shame the cohors Nazicae in his eyes." "We are not his chattel," Vardus muttered, though he was careful to keep his tone respectful. "We are warriors." Lucius's helm lenses narrowed. "We are art. He likes art. Remember that, and be worthy of being observed." The inner lock cycled, pressure equalized with a rumble through the deck. The outer door irised open in a slow, grinding motion that spoke more of theatricality than mechanical failure. The first thing that met them was not gunfire, but silence. The corridor beyond was a ribbed tunnel of fused hull plating and bone. Lumens set into the ceiling glowed a sickly pallid color, casting everything in tones of hospital light and grave wax. The air smelled of preservative chemicals, dried, blood and something else beneath, something sweet and rotten. They were not alone. Figures lined the walls like statues. Servitors, mostly. Their original forms had been obscured beneath layers of grafted tissue and machinery. Some had multiple arms ending in surgical tools. Others had no arms at all, their torsos fused into plinths that grew cables instead of limbs. Many had their eyes and mouths sewn shut, yet still turned to track the visitors with augmetic lenses and clicking Auspex arrays. Between those immobile guardians stood other shapes. One, nearer than the rest, shuffled forward as the Nasicae advanced. It might once have been an Astartes. Now its proportions were wrong, limbs too long, head too small. Its plate had been cut apart and refitted to accommodate extra vertebrae and a crooked spine. A second mouth had been stitched into its throat, the lips sealed, skin puckered around the sutures. It paused, swaying, then executed a clumsy bow, as if greeting nobles to their host's court. Vardus muttered a curse. Another warrior, Cassian, voiced nothing. His silence was a weight behind Lucius's shoulder. "His discarded toys," Lucius said, striding past the thing without slowing. "See what becomes of those who bore him." More abominations followed. Vat-grown grotesques whose muscles lay too perfectly under too thin skin, veins tracing precise patterns, eyes glassy with chemical control. Failed clones with half-formed organs visible beneath transparent dermis, pulsing weakly in the chill air. A thing that might have been two brothers fused side by side, armor and flesh knitted together, sharing a single pair of arms that ended in shears. They made no move to impede the cohors. They simply watched, a silent honor guard of failures. They descended through the station's levels, deeper into its heart. Here the architecture became increasingly less recognizable as the product of any one design. Deck plates from ships of the Great. Crusade lay side by side with hulks bearing the crude skull motifs of more recent renegades. The walls showed relics of many different ages and allegiances. All of it had been stripped of identity and refashioned into one overarching theme, the celebration of cut flesh and open bone. They came at last to a set of doors that had once belonged to an imperial flagship's strategium. Now the proud eagle was gone, ground away to make room for a symbol of a stylized rod entwined with serpents and thorns. The doors parted as they approached. The apothecarian of the spider spread out before them. It was vast, a cathedral of medicine and mutilation. Tier upon tier of operating platforms rose around a central pit, each populated by restrained figures in varying stages of dissection, enhancement, or decay. Mechanized cranes carried racks of tools from place to place, gleaming under the harsh lumen light. Scalpels, saws, injector rigs, proboscis-like limbs ending in syringes. Above it all, vent systems hissed and chuffed, breathing the room like a vast set of lungs. At the center, on a raised dais fashioned from what might have been the bridge of a once proud cruiser, stood Fabius Bile. He looked smaller than Lucius remembered, Time had not been kind to the primogenitor. His flesh hung gaunt on his bones, face lined and drawn, hair lank and thin. His skin had a yellowed cast like old parchment. Yet there was a vitality in his eyes that had not dimmed. They glittered behind thin lenses, sharp and avid, darting from one approaching figure to the next. Around his shoulders wrapped an alchemical harness, a fabrication of articulated metal and thick cables. From its frame sprouted mechadendrites tipped with syringes, saws, and other, less identifiable instruments. Vials of luminous fluid hung from its frame, sloshing with every movement he made. Each step he took was accompanied by the soft clink of glass and the faint squeal of pumps. "Lucius," he said, and the word was half greeting, half diagnosis. "I had wondered when you would crawl to my door." Lucius removed his helm and clipped it to his belt. The air of the apothecarian was cold and wet against his scarred skin. He let Fabius see the new cuts upon his face, the fresh blood threaded among the old. "Crawl?" he echoed, smiling thinly. "Spider, if I were crawling, your servitors would already have me on a slab." Fabius's gaze flicked over the scars. "You are still adding to the collection, I see. There will come a point when there is more welt than flesh left. You may wish to consider alternative canvases. And there will come a point when there is more machine than you," Lucius replied. "You may wish to consider dying while you still remember what it was to be Astartes." The mechadendrites flexed subtly behind the primogenitor's back like a disturbed nest of serpents. His expression did not change. "I remember more than you ever learned, child," he said. "I recall the gene narratives of primarchs, the slow unfurling of their flaws. I have set open the seed of entire legions and traced the patterns of their damnation. In comparison, your scars are merely an exercise in repetition." Lucius laughed, the sound bright in the cold chamber. "Ah, yes, this is why I almost missed you. Only you could take joy in such condescension." "Almost?" Fabius's eyebrows rose. "I am wounded." "I see that," Lucius said, letting his gaze travel pointedly over the other's withered frame. "Time gnaws at you like a starving rat. You look like a corpse propped up in a chemist's shop." "Decay is a condition to be measured and corrected," Fabius said. "Unlike devotion to a single god, which is an illness not yet classified properly." His eyes flicked to the sigils carved and painted into Lucius's armor, the hanging trinkets, the subtle movements of faces trapped beneath the surface. "Still carrying your choir?" "With you," he observed. "Tell me, does it bother you, knowing that every one of those is someone who once felt joy in killing you? That every step you take is accompanied by their protest?" "It delights me," Lucius said. "I wear their failure as plate. They were not enough. I was. That is all that matters." "Ah," Fabius murmured. The Third Legion in a single sentence. The insult slid off Lucius like oil from lacquer. This was their dance as much as any duel. Each cut was words rather than steel, but the intent behind them was no less lethal. "You have not invited me here only to mock my faith," Lucius said. "Nor have I come merely to listen to you catalogue my vices. You know why I am here." "Of course," Fabius said. "You have run out of bodies." He descended from the dais with surprising grace for one so seemingly frail. As he walked, cogitators flickered to life around the chamber, displaying streams of data, casualty tallies, ship, schematics, gene seed inventories. Lucius recognized some of the symbols, the coded shorthand of Legion apothecaries, long buried in his memory. A war band of such pedigree, Fabius mused, fingertips brushing a screen. Once a full company and more, champions famed across the Great Crusade. Now reduced to what precisely? Barely more than 24 Astartes under arms. No apothecaries, no serfs trained in basic harvesting procedures. Gene seeds spoiled in the corpses of your fallen, or corrupted beyond reliable use by millennia of overindulgence. He flicked another set of runes. Images of the cohors Nasikai's armor scrolled past, captured by the station's auspex as they docked. Mismatched plates, patch repairs, scavenged loyalties. Your war gear is a patchwork quilt of looted relics and battlefield expedients, Fabius went on. Your ship is a ruin held together by stubbornness and myth. You rely on reputation to keep lesser predators at bay. It will not last. Predators grow hungry enough, and they forget fear. Lucius's jaw tightened. You speak as if this does not amuse you. It amuses me greatly, Fabius said. In the way a collapsing arch amuses an architect. It is a predictable result of known flaws. But it also offends my sense of economy. You are wasteful, Lucius. That rankles. He turned, folding his skeletal hands before him. You come to me because you know this, he said. You know that without intervention, your cohors will dwindle to a handful of madmen in relic plate, snarling in dark corners of the eye until some warp boar or demon finishes you out of boredom. That is an ignoble ending for so carefully honed a blade. And you, Lucius said, offer what? A scabbard? A place on your wall? I offer what I always offer, Fabius replied. Improvement, continuation, transcendence of your current limitations. He gestured with one thin hand. Panels opened in the walls around the apothecarian. Within, Lucius saw things moving. Forms that were not quite human, not quite Astartes. Muscles grown in perfect proportion in nutrient vats. Limbs hanging, ready to be grafted. Armor shells held in suspension, their surfaces bare, waiting to be decorated by experience and ego. I can rebuild the cohors Nazikai, Fabius said. Your name still carries weight among our scattered brothers. There are 3rd Legion remnants and other less noble outcasts who would answer your summons if the right pressures were applied. There are clones I have grown that require direction. There are vat-born thralls who could be uplifted to something approaching your standard, given sufficient time and suffering. He stepped closer, the chemical smell of his harness strong. In return, he said softly, I will take samples, bone, blood, gene seed. I will study the singular gift your patron has woven into you. Your ability to return from death through the sin of your killers is a fascinating aberration. I would understand it, catalogue it, perhaps even reproduce it. Lucius felt the mechadendrites twitch, as if they scented his flesh. You would make more like me, he said, voice flat. I would try, Fabius said. Failure would be instructive. Success would be a wonder. Imagine an entire cadre of duelists who cannot truly die, so long as there are still beings capable of taking pleasure in killing them. Think of the strategic implications. Lucius laughed, sharp and harsh. You dress it in strategy because you think that will sway me, he said. But we both know the truth. You want to pry me open on a table and see what spills out. You cannot bear not knowing how something works. Correct, Fabius said without shame. Ignorance offends me. Lucius met his gaze. Pride warred with practicality. The thought of bearing his curse to the primogenitor's knives twisted his gut. Yet the vision of marching into battle at the head of a renewed warband, ranks swollen with new Astartes, armor resplendent and weapons plentiful, had its own allure. His legend could not be carried forward by a handful of walking relics. It required an audience. It required witnesses. Your words drip mockery, he said quietly. You see me as a specimen, not a lord. You are both, Fabius replied. Greatness and pathology often coexist. I do not deny that you are a lethal work of art. I simply insist on studying the artist's process. And if I refuse? Lucius asked. Fabius shrugged, a skeletal motion. Then you limp from here with the same dwindling core of killers, the same exhausted warship, the same trajectory toward oblivion. I will watch from a distance as the galaxy erases you. Perhaps I will send servitors to collect what is left when you are finally gone. Lucius's fingers tightened around the hilt of his sword. The idea of walking away burned his pride. The idea of accepting the spider's terms burned it differently. Behind him, the silent ranks of the cohorts shifted slightly, armor plates rasping. They could not hear every word of the exchange, but they understood its weight. They knew they were standing at the edge of a choice that would decide whether their name carried into future centuries or ended here in this reeking hall. "Very well," Lucius said at last. "We will accept your improvement. You will have your samples. You will have the right to watch and to meddle. But understand this, Spider. I am not your creation. I am not your project. I am the favored blade of the Phoenician and the chosen duelist of the Dark Prince. If you overreach..." He drew his sword a handspan, letting the light catch along its edge. "I will show you that your own flesh is not exempt from lesson." Fabius smiled then, a thin, dry expression that did not reach his eyes. "Threats," he said softly. "How nostalgic. You will find that I am more amenable to them than most. They remind me of simpler times." He extended a hand. The bargain that followed was not sealed with parchment and ink. Fabius's acolytes came forward, robed figures with augmetic eyes and hands stained permanently with antiseptic and ichor. They brought blades of obsidian and bone, heated in braziers of blue flame. They brought brands shaped in the sigils of the Third Legion, and in more esoteric patterns that belonged to the primogenitor alone. Lucius stripped his gauntlet and took one of the knives himself. With it, he opened the flesh of his palm, letting the blood well and drip into a waiting chalice of twisted glass. Fabius did the same, his crimson flowing darker, thicker with alchemical additives. A robed acolyte mixed the two, chanting in a dead tongue whose cadences woke echoes in the warp. On the armor of the cohors Nasicae, brands were pressed, hot metal searing ceramite and whatever lay beneath. New sigils flared to life beside ancient legion markings, symbols of accord. On bare flesh, the knife traced patterns that mirrored those carved into Lucius's own skin, binding gene to gene in a lattice of obligation. The air grew heavier. The shrieks in Lucius's armor swelled, harmonizing into something like laughter. A pressure settled on the apothecarian, palpable even to mortals. It was not the focused malice of a single god's attention, but rather the delighted interest of the warp itself at a new note being woven into its eternal cacophony. When it was done, Lucius flexed his hand. The cut there was already knitting, the edges drawn together by unnatural force. In Fabius's chalice, the mingled blood writhed, patterns forming and breaking like thoughts half grasped. "It is sealed," the primogenitor said. "Your cohors will be refitted, gene seed extracted, clones awakened, thralls elevated. I will begin my studies. You will begin to receive results." Lucius inclined his head minutely. "See that? Your results are worthy of me." He turned, signaling his warriors with a tilt of his helm. "Come. There is much to oversee. I will not have my brothers remade into mindless beasts." Fabius watched them go, the mechadendrites of his harness shifting in slow, thoughtful arcs. Only when Lucius and his retinue had left the apothecarian did he speak again, his voice addressed not to them, but to the acolytes hovering at the edges of the chamber. "Send word," he said. "Our associates in the shadow cities will be pleased to hear that the bait has entered the web." One of the robed figures bowed. "To which cabal, master?" "To all of them who still think they can cheat death with pain," Fabius answered. "Remind the homunculi of the Dark City that our arrangement stands. They desired champions for their arenas. I have just bound the finest duelist in the eye into my ledger. Opportunity rarely knocks so loudly." He walked away from the central dais, deeper into the apothecarian's inner sanctum. Here the light dimmed. Stasis fields hummed softly. bathing rows of sealed vaults in cold radiance. Each one held something taken from Comora and its kin, racks of serrated hooks that moved in slow, hungry arcs even at rest, injector frames designed to interface with Astartes' physiology, cages woven of light and agony. Fabius paused before a particular vault. Within, suspended in gravitic clamps, hung an intricate exoskeletal harness, bristling with injector spines and chem ampules. It was shaped to clasp a warrior's back, to dig its thorns into spine and nerve, to flood muscles with carefully balanced toxins and stimulants. A gift, he mused, originally meant for some favored gladiator in a distant arena of the Dark City. He had persuaded its previous owner that his own work would be of greater interest in the long term. The homunculus had not agreed, but their disagreement had been rendered moot by certain decisive incisions. "Yes," Fabius murmured, "this will do nicely. The web must be fed from both ends after all. The Xenos hunger for spectacle. I hunger for data. The gods hunger for narrative." He laid one thin hand against the stasis field. It crackled faintly under his touch. "Dance for me, Lucius," he whispered. "Dance for them all. Let us see how many times you can die before even your patron grows bored." The vault lights pulsed once, in time with some distant monstrous heartbeat. Outside, the station's hull creaked as the first of the cohors Nasicae were led to their refitting, unaware that the bargain they had struck had placed them firmly in the spider's web. They went to the knives in silence. The cohors Nasicae filed into the primogenitor's apothecarian in a slow procession, armor plates whispering over one another, boots ringing dull echoes from the stained deck. In other days, they had marched into battle to the thunder of war drums and the shriek of sonics. Here, their only accompaniment was the hiss of vented chem clouds and the occasional wet suck of a pump somewhere in the shadows. The chamber devoured them. It rose tier upon tier above and below, an abyss of operating platforms and hanging frames. Each level held its own array of tables and restraint rigs, its own bank of cogitators and alchemical engines. Chains hung from the ceiling in tangles, some bearing hooks, some bearing cages of bone, some bearing nothing at all save crusted stains. Along the outer walls, racks of transparent cylinders stood in serried ranks, each one holding something that once had been part of a living being. Organs drifted in suspension, nerves trailing like seaweed, mouths still moving in soundless attempts at screaming. Lumens glowed a nauseous white, too clean for the rust on the restraints or the dried black patches on the floor. The air was cold, laced with antiseptic and the sharp tang of metal and old blood. Fabius's servitors took the cohors in hand. Some shambled forward on iron limbs, their remaining flesh bleached and tattooed with surgical diagrams. Others rolled on tracks, upper bodies bristling with autograph tools and injector rigs. Their faces, where they still had faces, were empty of expression. Their hands were sure. "On the tables," a robed acolyte intoned, "by cohorts and squads. There will be order in this." Lucius watched from a high gallery, resting his gauntleted hands on the rail. Below, his warriors obeyed. No one struggled. A few spat curses, others laughed with a brittle edge, but all took their places. Chains clattered as restraints snapped shut around their limbs and across their chests. Mechanized limbs descended, testing bindings with impersonal strength. Lucius's helm lenses tracked each of them. Cassian lay back without a word, one eye staring up at the ceiling as a halo of surgical lights irised open above him. Vardus sneered, muttering blasphemies until a gag was locked into place. Over his teeth, younger names, less firmly etched into Lucius's memory, disappeared beneath swarms of automata. The first cut was almost delicate. Fabius moved among the tables with practiced ease, mechadendrites twitching in slow, thoughtful arcs. He wore a stained apron over his armor, more as habit than protection. Each motion of his thin hands brought a new blade to bear, a new vial of fluid, a new instrument whose purpose was not entirely obvious at first glance. Bones were opened with neat saw strokes, not to strip them, but to thread them with filaments of alien metal. Lucius saw glimmers of unfamiliar alloys, faintly iridescent even under the harsh lamps, vanishing into marrow. Nerve clusters were exposed with almost loving care, teased free of the surrounding flesh and rerouted along new pathways. Tiny engines, no larger than teeth, were implanted at junctions, their chittering movements sending ripples along exposed musculature. "Your bodies were crafted to be instruments," Fabius said, more to himself than to the conscious minds around him. "Over centuries you have dulled them with indulgence. I merely retune them." He gestured, and a mechadendrite extended a nozzle over a waiting chest. With a hiss, it sprayed a thin film of translucent, chameleonic material over the open tissue. The substance sank in, as if alive, sealing, bonding, knitting. The warrior on the table arched, back bowing, restrained limbs straining. The moan that tore from his throat was thick with both pain and something close to exaltation. On another level, a sibling screamed as a cluster of implants were pressed along the spine, each one a knot of circuitry and hooked tendrils. The devices bit into vertebrae, burrowing. A cogitator nearby chattered, recording spikes in neural activity as fresh pathways opened, connecting sensation to centers in the brain that were never meant to receive so much input. "Higher response to stimulation," an acolyte noted, adjusting a dial. "Combat reflex arcs improved by a factor of—" "Spare me the arithmetic," Fabius snapped without looking up. "Mark it as effective. We are not training riflemen. We are pruning roses of steel." Lucius listened to the cries that rose from the tables, the grunts, the half-choked laughter of those who tried to turn agony into a jest. The sounds slid over his armor like rain on glass, and the souls bound within responded. The faces on his breastplate shifted, mouths opening, eyes bulging. They took up the chorus, each shriek fed back and amplified in a discordant harmony. Some of the trapped visages seemed to drink in the pain around them with relish, as if the suffering of the living eased their own. Others contorted in fresh torment, reliving in memory the knives that had made them part of his plate. It pleased him. He stood there like a host presiding over a banquet, only half aware of the mechadendrites that slithered past his boots, the acolytes that glanced up and away whenever his helm turned their direction. If he was honest, there was something of a jailer in his posture as well. These were his warriors, but they were also his offerings. He had brought them to the spider's web, and now watched as the primogenitor wrapped them afresh. One by one, they were taken apart and reassembled. When the cohort's first cycle through the tables was complete, when the restraints unlocked and the mechanisms withdrew, the Astartes rose slowly. They were not the same. Movement came easier to them, but with it came a tremor, a barely suppressed shiver of craving. Their senses flared, picking up the tiniest shifts in air currents, the faintest chemical traces. Cassian flexed his fingers, watching the tendons shift beneath his gauntlets, as if seeing them for the first time. "You said he would make us better," he voxed to Lucius. "He has made us sharper." "Blades are meant to be sharp," Lucius replied. "Be grateful he has not yet decided you would be more interesting as a hammer." The time came, inevitably, when the spider's curiosity turned fully upon Lucius himself. It began in an inner chamber, screened off from the main apothecarian by hanging strips of cured skin inscribed with scrolling annotations. Here the light was softer, the lamplight tinged with a greenish hue. Shelves lined the walls, bearing rows of specimen jars, their contents floating in preserving fluids. Some of those preserved faces looked unsettlingly familiar. Fabius's servitors helped Lucius unseal his armor. It came apart like a shell, inner locks disengaging, plates sliding away. The cries of the souls bound within rose to a fresh crescendo as their prison was opened. They pressed against the inner surfaces, features distorting the metal, fingers seeming to stretch from beneath, to clutch at the edges, before being forced back by the mechanisms that fed upon them. Lucius stood bare-chested on the cold metal of a raised platform. Even without his ceramite, he was massive, his frame a testament to gene-forged perfection and centuries of warfare. Scar tissue mapped his skin like a second script, each line recording a duel, a victory, a moment of chosen pain. Fabius circled him with the careful attention of a craftsman inspecting a masterpiece. "Hold still," the primogenitor said, as if addressing an unruly child. "Do not spoil my lines." He pressed gloved fingers to a jagged cut along Lucius's jaw, one of the more recent marks. "This was not here the last time we met," he observed. "Few of the old ones remain untouched," Lucius replied. "One must make room." "When you speak of those who have killed you," Fabius said, "I have noticed that your scars move." He gestured, and an acolyte brought a vox recorder closer. "Tell me of the last time you died, Lucius," Fabius invited. Lucius's lips curled. "If you wanted me to revisit my old triumphs, Spider, you need only have asked." "Indulge me," Fabius said. "Imagine for a moment that this chamber is your audience, and I am not its least appreciative member." Lucius laughed once, sharp as a cut. "There was a warband of ragged sons from another legion," he began. "They fancied themselves artists because they painted skulls on their armor and called their savagery a creed. Their champion had taken 3 of my brother's heads and thought himself my equal." As he spoke, the scars on his chest shifted almost imperceptibly. Fabius's lenses brightened, recording the movement. A mechadendrite extended a wafer-fine sensor and hovered just above the skin without touching. Lucius went on, describing the clash, the thrill of a blade that almost matched his own, the moment of misjudged distance, the heat of the weapon biting through his own defenses. He spoke of the rush as his body failed, a sensation flared and broke as his killer exulted. "He laughed," Lucius said softly, remembering. "Oh, he laughed. He thought he had ended me. He tasted victory and pride. It was exquisite." "And then?" Fabius asked. Lucius smiled. "And then he became me." The armor pieces stacked nearby trembled. Faces rippled across their surfaces, one in particular swelling outwards, its expression that of a warrior caught between ecstasy and horror. The scar across Lucius's ribs crawled, reconfiguring to match the pattern on that spectral countenance. "Fascinating," Fabius breathed. "The narrative matters, the emotional resonance. Simple killing is insufficient. There must be pleasure, hubris. Your patron has woven a conditional clause into your curse." "Of course," Lucius said. "Nothing great is achieved without joy." Fabius moved to the armor, hands hovering over the shifting visages as if warming them on a hearth. "Even this obeys rules," he murmured. "Chaos wraps its gifts in superstition and romance, but underneath there are structures, causes, effects. You are not exempt." He turned back, eyes glittering. "I will map this," he said. "Every time you speak of a death, every time you remember a particular wound, I will record which scars twitch, which faces howl. I will find the boundaries of this phenomenon." "And then," Lucius asked, "you will poke them to see if they bleed?" "If there is a rule," Fabius said, "it can be broken, or at the very least bent. Imagine if I can disconnect the curse from your own flesh. Imagine if I can graft it onto another, a cohort of Eternals, growing and replacing themselves with every indulgent killer they face." Lucius's laughter filled the chamber, harsh and bright. "And you call my devotion an illness," he said. "Listen to yourself, Spider. You sound almost as if you worship the data." "Worship is a crude word for the pursuit of understanding," Fabius said. "But if the shoe fits, as the old saying goes, make a note of its size." He gestured to the servitors. "Reassemble him," he ordered. "I have what I need for now. There is work for his sword, while I test my handiwork on his followers." Rearmored and rearmed, Lucius was sent to another part of the station to see what his remade cohorts could do. The dueling hall had once been a launch bay. Its exterior had been sealed and strengthened, its interior stripped and refitted. Suspensor platforms hung in the air at varying heights, each bearing targets or hazards, spinning blades, swinging weights, emitter nodes that spat arcs of contained energy. The deck was a patchwork of scarred armor glass and old hull plates, slick with oils and other stains that offered scant traction. Lucius stepped into its center and drew the faultless blade. Opposite him, one of the newly improved champions stood ready. The warrior's armor bore fresh incisions where implants had been inserted. His movements were wrong at first glance, a fraction too quick, as if his body were responding before his thoughts arrived. There was a tremor in the way he held his own blade, a hungry eagerness. "Begin," Fabius's voice echoed from a gallery above. The duel was a storm. They closed with a speed neither would have possessed before the spider's attentions. Steel kissed steel. Sparks showered the deck. The improved champion pressed hard, blows raining down from unexpected angles as new reflexes drove his limbs. Lucius yielded ground for a few heartbeats, testing, tasting, taking measure. There was something intoxicating in the way his opponent moved. Every feint carried an extra twist, every parry a subtle adjustment. He could feel, even from here, the way pain and pleasure centers in the champion's brain flared with each impact, each strain of muscle. Fabius had tuned him to respond to battle like a musician to a favorite instrument. It was almost a shame. When the mistake came, it was small. A step taken a fraction too far. A follow-through a heartbeat too long. Old instinct warred with new pathways, a momentary conflict in the synapses. Lucius saw it, slipped inside the guard, and let his blade drop. The champion's sword arm left him at the elbow. He staggered, shock cutting through the change-drugged haze. Lucius spun, reversed his grip, and struck the side of the helm with the pommel. Ceramite cracked. The warrior went down hard, visor shattered, blood bright against the deck. "Better," Lucius said, standing over him, "but still not enough." "Do not kill him," Fabius called. "I have not finished with that one." Other bouts followed. The improved cohorts came at him alone, then in pairs, then in small squads. Each time, the hall became a dance floor, each footstep and swing a step in a pattern only Lucius saw completely. The ground grew more treacherous as the duels wore on, slicker with spilled fluid, strewn with shattered visors and discarded limbs. The station's servitors waited at the edges, ready to gather the fallen for further work. Word began to spread while steel sang. Thralls whispered in the low corridors as they ferried biomatter and machinery from store to store. Acolytes traded rumors over cooled cups of nutrient sludge. Even the servitors, minds supposedly bound by code, twitched in certain ways when passing messages from one master to another. They spoke of visitors from beyond the eye, of a cabal in the dark city whose homunculi had taken an interest, of a price agreed, measured not in simple slaves, but in rarer coin, renegade Astartes, legionaries with unique traits, warriors who could bleed and suffer in ways that would delight both data-hungry minds and pain-obsessed Xenos. The name of Lucius the Eternal passed between broken mouths in tones of avarice. "He is worth more than a score of ordinary gladiators," one acolyte said, not realizing that Cassian stood in the shadows nearby. "The arenas of Comorag would kill for such stock." "Their knives may have the chance," replied another, chuckling. "The master speaks often with those who dwell between real space and the web. Deals are made. Cargo is tallied." Cassian carried those words to Lucius, after a bout in which the faultless blade had humbled 3 of the newly forged champions at once. "They talk as if we are crates of ammunition," the veteran said, helm under one arm, sweat steaming from his scarred scalp, as if our worth is counted in the weight we fetch in some market. Lucius cleaned his sword with a practiced motion and slid it home. "Everything in this galaxy has a price," he said. "Even gods. Why should we be exempt?" Cassian hesitated. "Do you trust him, Lord?" Lucius smiled without warmth. "I trust Fabius to be Fabius," he said. "He will never waste a specimen without gaining something from the loss. He will never betray someone without profiting from the betrayal." "And us?" Cassian pressed. "What does he gain from us beyond his studies?" Lucius thought of the stasis vault, of the Comorite devices that had gleamed under cold light. He thought of the way Fabius had spoken of arrangements with the Dark City's dwellers. "We will see," he said. He did not have to wait long to see the first strand of that web thicken. The meeting took place in a chamber deep within the station, a place where illumination came from braziers burning thin, acrid flame beneath hanging forms. Skins, flayed clean and stretched into banners, shifted slowly in currents of heated air. Some bore legion symbols, others displayed sigils that did not belong to any human tongue. Eyes and mouths had been removed, but the shapes of the faces remained, forever locked in their last expressions. Lucius watched from a shadowed alcove, his presence tolerated, but unannounced. Fabius stood in the room's center, back straight, mechadendrites coiled in an approximation of relaxed posture. Opposite him waited a tall, slender figure in armor that flowed like living obsidian. The Drukhari emissary's helm was a smooth mask, featureless save for its eye slits, and an ornate crest that evoked the dorsal fin of some predatory beast. Its armor was layered plates and flexible mesh, each etched with curving glyphs. Blades hung from every joint, some folded, some unfolded and ready, giving the impression that every movement would cut. They spoke in low Gothic, laced with harsher sounds, a shared tongue corrupted in different directions. "You ask much," the emissary said, voice smooth and cold. "Renegade gene stock is not so rare that we will trade our finest pharmacopoeia for it." "I do not offer you merely renegades," Fabius replied. "I offer you legend. I offer you a champion whose name is known from Terra's walls to the deepest pits of the eye. I offer you an eternal duel, played out in your arenas for as long as there are fools willing to test themselves against him." He did not speak Lucius's name aloud, but both parties knew. The Drukhari tilted its head. "The one whose skin changes," it said. "The one whose killers wear his face. Our homunculi have heard tales. They are intrigued. They would be more than intrigued when they see him bleed and rise again on your stages," Fabius said. "Think of the crowds you could draw. Think of the noble cabals who would pay fortunes for a single chance to best him. Think of the agony you could harvest from their failures." "And what do you ask in return?" the emissary said. "Beyond your curiosity's indulgence?" "Slaves," Fabius said simply, "of certain qualities, augmetics of your own devising, combat stim frames suitable for integration with Astartes' physiology, samples of your more interesting toxins, access to a portion of your archives on nerve induction and pain modulation." The Drukhari laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You bargain like a true denizen of the dark," it said. "You would sell your own kind into our pits for a chest of toys and a book of scars." "I am long past thinking in terms of kind," Fabius replied. "There are only resources. Your city understands this." They haggled, words circling, terms adjusted. At every mention of the champion, at every casual reference to his curse, Lucius felt a flicker of cold along his spine. Finer points of the bargain drew lines around more than himself. The emissary spoke of cohorts, of war bands, of cargo holds full of chained warriors ready for spectacle. When the Drukhari at last inclined its helmed head in agreement and extended a hand sheathed in cruelly elegant gauntlet, Fabius took it without hesitation. Their clasp was brief, but binding. Later, when the emissary had gone, Lucius intercepted the primogenitor in one of the station's many arteries. Chemical lamplight painted Fabius's features in sickly hues, emphasizing the hollows of his eyes and the gaunt line of his jaw. "You sell my name cheaply," Lucius said, stepping from the shadows. Fabius did not start. He had expected such a confrontation sooner or later. "On the contrary," he replied, "I sell it at a premium. You should be flattered. There are entire warbands that would not fetch a tenth of your worth in the markets of Comora." Lucius's hand drifted toward his sword hilt. "These rumors of arenas and pits," he said, "of champions traded like curiosities. You will explain them." "I have done nothing but explain since you arrived," Fabius said, exasperation creeping into his tone. "I have explained your own weakness to you. I have explained what I can do to correct it. Must I also explain to you how commerce works?" "Do not dissemble, Spider," Lucius growled. "Are we to march from here to fresh war or to chains?" Fabius regarded him for a long moment. "You are too valuable to waste on a single transaction," he said at last. "Yes, I have made arrangements. Yes, certain cabals have expressed interest, but interest and ownership are not the same. Think, Lucius, what would a stint in the arenas of the Dark City do to your reputation, to your legend? The tales that would spread, the fear, the awe. When you inevitably escaped, you would be more than the cohor's lord. You would be the blade that carved a path through the heart of Comora." "You speak as if escape is a given," Lucius said. "It is inevitable," Fabius said calmly. "You are too stubborn to remain in anyone's collar for long. That is part of what makes you such a worthwhile investment." He smiled thinly. "Besides," he added, "do you truly think your patron would allow you to rot away in some foreign pit without extracting a story from it? The gods are as bound by narrative as any mortal. They enjoy a fall from grace, followed by bloody ascendance." Lucius held his gaze, searching for some crack in the certainty. He sensed more than he understood, threads of fate and ambition crossing. Fabius believed what he said. That did not mean he would not sacrifice others along the way. "Remember this," Lucius said quietly. "If you are lying to me, if your little games compromise my legend beyond what I deem acceptable, I will kill you. And if you enjoy dying, I will wear your face." Fabius's eyes glittered. "The data that would produce," he murmured. "Tempting." He inclined his head. "For now, Lucius, you have what you wanted. A rebuilt warband, improved bodies, a ship whose holds no longer ring hollow. Take your cohors and leave my station. Seek war, spill blood, make music. When the time comes for the next stage of our collaboration, I assure you that events will draw you where you need to be." The preparations to depart began with the dull efficiency of long practice. The cohors Nasikai returned to their vessel by squads, boots ringing on the boarding tubes. Armor clanked, freshly reinforced plates testing against the exertion. Mortal crews scurried under the supervision of servitors, hauling crates of munitions and alchemical stores. New thralls, their eyes wide and their minds bound, shuffled into assigned berths. Lucius stood in the embarkation bay, watching his warriors file past. He could see the changes in them now more clearly. They moved with an ease that bordered on predatory glide, every motion economical and precise. Their reactions were sharper, their gazes brighter. Yet woven through it all, he saw the twitchiness of those whose nerves had been tuned too finely, the faint tremor of addicts scenting a promised dose. They were better killers. They were also closer to the edge. Cassian paused briefly before him. "We march as we once did," the veteran said. "Almost. It feels strange." "You will grow used to it," Lucius said. "We are instruments that have been restrung. The notes will settle with use." Cassian nodded and moved on. When the last of the cohors had boarded, When the umbilicus had withdrawn and the station's docking clamps had released, the strike cruiser's engines rumbled to fresh life. In the Apothecarian, Fabius monitored systems and checked off inventories. In the depths of the station, stasis vaults hummed, Comorite devices gleaming in their artificial sleep. The ship turned away from the station, prow angling toward the roiling wound in the stars that marked the Eye of Terror's reach. Thrusters flared, shields powered up. In his strategium, Lucius stood before the hololith, watching the ghost image of the spider's lair recede. "Set course," he ordered. "We have prey to find." The helmsman obeyed. On the viewing display, the station dwindled. In one dim window, unseen by those aboard the departing cruiser, a thin figure in stained armor watched their departure with a scholar's satisfaction. Fabius Bile raised a cup of recaf in half-mocking salute to the distant speck. "Run, Blade," he murmured. "Run and see what web you fly into." In the cold between stars, the cohorts Nasicae sailed, their hearts set on war glory, blind to the fact that someone had already marked them as cargo for a darker destination. The refitted cruiser slid from the spider's lair like a blade leaving its sheath. Her engines burned steadier now, the coughing and stuttering less pronounced. Fresh patches of armor, darker than the surrounding hull, showed where Fabius's servitors and slave techs had grafted on new plates. Lumen slits along her flanks glowed like watchful eyes. Vox masts twitched, whispering streams of binaric and corrupted catechism as the ship angled away from the corpse ring station. Within her, the cohorts Nasicae stirred. Newly improved Astartes moved through the decks with unsettling precision. Where once there had been a drag to their step, the weariness of long war layered upon overindulged muscles, now there was a tautness, a constant readiness. Servos hummed in their armor, responsive, eager. Nerve impulses leapt faster down rewired paths, turning every flicker of thought into the twitch of a finger on a trigger, the twist of a blade. In the lower holds, vat-grown thralls huddled in ranks, eyes dull with conditioning, limbs thicker than any mortal conscripts. They bore the faint marks of the spider's scalpel, surgical scars traced in precise arcs, chemical brands noting batch and function. Around them, stolen crew from half a dozen worlds learned new hierarchies under the fists and boots of veteran serfs. Over all of it, the ship's machine spirit muttered and brooded. Fabius's tampering had soothed some of its fractures, coaxing it toward its old capacity, but the scars of past torpedo hits and reactor burns remained. It slept, with one eye open, dreaming of lance duels and boarding actions. Lucius stood in the strategium as the starfield turned. The hololith before him showed a representation of the void as threads and rents, the currents of the immaterium flowing in ways that could never truly be mapped, but could be hinted at with enough heresy and damaged cogitators. The station behind them was a ghost image, fading as distance increased. "Prey?" he asked, not taking his gaze from the shifting lights. The spider's augure's whisper of a convoy, the helmsman replied from his pit. Sweat beaded the mortal's brow. Even speaking in the presence of the faultless blade taxed his nerve. Imperial munitions, escorted by one escort class and a handful of smaller ships. Their course will bring them through a shoal where the warp is thin. He suggested, Lucius cut in, that this would be a good opportunity to test his work. The word suggested carried the weight of a command and a promise of data in Fabius's lexicon. Lucius's lips curved. "So be it," he said. "Set. Course! Ready the guns. When we make translation, I want the cohorts at their stations and hungry." He left the strategium to the mutter of mortal voices and the distant grumble of reactors spinning up for the plunge. In the transit decks, sirens wailed the old Legion calls to the warp. Cultists banged chains against bulkheads, chanting litanies to ward against and invite the same horrors. The navigator performed his private blasphemies in the lightless tower hands slick with oils distilled from substances no sane apothecary would name. Protective wards flared along the hull, some in the shape of the eightfold star, others in older, more elegant curves that belonged to a more refined creed. The Geller field rose, thrumming through the deck like a captured storm. Reality buckled. There was always that moment, balanced on the knife edge, when Lucius felt the universe draw breath. Then the world inverted around him. The familiar points of the void stretched, twisted, became lines of impossible color, before shattering into the roiling madness of the sea. The ship dove. Warp light washed across the viewports in waves. Ghostly shapes pressed against the field, hungry and curious. Some wore the outline of things once human. Others never had. They smeared themselves across the barrier, leaving tracks of cold that sank through the decks and into the bones of those within. In some corridors, whispers grew loud enough to be indistinguishable from speech. Hands scratched at the insides of skulls. The cohors Nazicae laughed at it. Standing in the armory, helm cradled in the crook of one arm, Lucius watched his warriors run their final checks. Bolters were loaded with shells, whose mass-reactive cores had been adjusted to the fractions by Fabius's techs. Chains wards revved, their teeth sharpened on xenostone. Newly installed combat stim ports pulsed faintly along the spines and ribs of improved Astartes, waiting to flood bodies with chem symphonies at a thought. "You feel it?" Vardus asked over the internal vox, flexing his gauntleted hands. "The way the world sharpens when the engines howl." "Do not mistake the spider's work for divine favor," Cassian replied. "Chemicals and metal, they are tools, no more." Lucius smiled. "You speak as if divine favor does not often arrive in the form of a tool," he said. "Our patron delights in anything that heightens sensation. If the spider has made us feel more keenly, then for once his meddling aligns with true art." He donned his helm, sealing it with the hiss of pressured air. The armor of shrieking souls hummed, faces pressing outward against the plates, eager for what came next. The warning chime came sooner than expected. "Translation in 30 heartbeats," the navigator's voice rasped over the shipwide channel. "Gravitic readings anomalous. Warp currents turbulent. Hold." Lucius moved to the nearest bulkhead viewport. Warp light flickered, dimmed. The world wrenched. Reality snapped back like a whip. The void reasserted itself in a blaze of stars, but not the serene emptiness they had left. It was crowded here. Too crowded. They had translated into an ambush. Sleek shapes cut through the darkness around them, their hulls blades of obsidian and knotted bone. They glided on silent grav drives, no thruster flare to betray their movement. Their profiles almost invisible, except when starlight caught their edges and made them gleam like knives. Sails of some strange crystalline material unfurled, catching currents that did not exist for human senses. Drukhari raiders. They moved like sharks, circling a wounded beast, their courses intersecting and looping with obscene grace. Lances of caged lightning spat from their prows, stabbing at the cruiser's shields. Splinter cannons vomited glittering storms that left corrosive afterimages on the auspex. One of the Xeno's vessels passed so close that Lucius could see the silhouettes of warriors lining its decks, slender figures hanging from hook rigs, ready to launch. "Shields to full!" the helmsman shouted, panic cracking his voice. "All batteries! Fire at will!" Restraints snapped away from gunnery crews. Macro cannon boomed. Lance arrays spat spears of pure energy, searching for targets that were there and then not, flickering out of trajectory on impossible vectors. The cruiser's guns were meant to duel other Imperial craft, predictable in their plodding adherence to Newtonian logic. Against the piratical elegance of Comoros' children, they were clumsy fists swatting at wasps. On the bridge, Lucius watched a hollow representation of his ship's shields flicker under the assault. Runes shifted from green to amber as splinter storms and focused blasts ate away at the outer layers. They knew when and where we would arrive, Cassian said quietly from his post at Lucius's side. This is no random encounter. No, Lucius agreed. No, it is not. The spider's web tightened. Prepare for boarding, Lucius voxed to the cohors. Let the Xenos come to us. Wake the machine spirit of this ship. Call to it with blood. Today we test these new nerves on something more interesting than servitor flesh. He left the strategium at a run, his enhanced senses already drinking in the rising pitch of battle. Klaxons wailed. Bulkhead doors slammed shut in sequence. In some corridors, atmosphere vented deliberately, leaving only Astartes and sealed servitors standing in the sudden vacuum, ready to meet whatever tore its way through the hull. Lucius took position in one of the main transit axes, a long tunnel lined with alcoves and side passages, wide enough for squad-on-squad engagement. The deck vibrated under his boots as the cruiser rolled, trying to present less wounded flanks to the circling raiders. Around him, his warriors locked armor seals and checked weapon charges. There was an edge to their breathing, a faint hitch as the new stimulants dripped into their bloodstreams from implants keyed to combat readiness. Vision sharpened, sound clarified. Every heartbeat thudded like a drum. Here they come, someone murmured. The hull screamed. Something ripped into the outer plating with the shriek of tortured metal and the spiteful hiss of fields meeting. The deck lurched as an object punched into the ship's side, its own grav fields biting. For a heartbeat there was nothing, just the echo of impact. Then cutting charges detonated. White-hot lines scored the corridor wall. Metal sagged, turned half liquid. A flower of wreckage bloomed inward, petals of hull and conduit spreading. Through the gap came shapes, slender forms in barbed armor, helmets with sharp visors, limbs moving with liquid, predatory speed. The Drukhari flowed into the corridor like spilled shadow. They came in a screaming wave, shrieking in their own slicing tongue, weapons already up. Splinter rifles spat needles that left blackened corrosion wherever they struck. Hook blades and chains in their hands gleamed hungrily as they closed the distance. Lucius felt his blood sing. "Cohors!" he roared, his external vox turning the word into a thunderclap. "Show these carrion what it is to duel a son of the Phoenician." They met the Xenos charge in a crash of bodies. The faultless blade cleared its sheath in one smooth arc. Lucius stepped into the oncoming wave, feet finding perfect purchase, even on a deck beginning to slick with spilled fluid. He cut a Drukhari in half with the first stroke, barbed armor offering as little resistance as paper. A second lunged for his helm, twin blades darting for the lenses. He twisted, let them scrape across his gorget, and drove his elbow into the alien's face with concussive force. Around him, the improved cohors unleashed themselves. Their weapons moved faster than before, guided not only by honed muscle memory, but by artificially heightened response. Stims flared through their veins, translating impact and injury into surges of exultation rather than shock. Splinter needles that found chinks in armor burned like fire beneath their skin, but those who took them only roared louder, charging deeper into the fray. For a moment, it was perfect. The corridor became a whirl of steel and alien grace. Drukhari leapt from walls and ceiling, their grav harnesses carrying them in impossible arcs. Astartes met them with iron discipline and unnatural speed, bolters roaring at point-blank range, chain blades chewing through delicate limbs. Lucius moved at the center, a storm within the storm, his sword carving ordered patterns through the chaos. He felt alive in a way he had not in cycles. Then, without warning, something went wrong. It began as a faint glitch in his vision, a momentary double image as he parried an oncoming strike. The reverberation of the impact seemed to echo longer than it should. His hand, moving to riposte, stuttered very slightly in its arc. For a swordsman of his caliber, that fraction was an insult. His tongue tasted metal, not the familiar tang of blood, but a chemical bite that oozed from the back of his throat. Across the Vox, a warrior cursed. "Lord!" Vardas gasped, his voice cracking. "My limbs!" Another voice howled, wordless this time, not in pain from a blade, but in sudden, inexplicable spasm. Lucius cut down another raider, noting with cold clarity that the motion had felt sluggish. His fingers did not respond with their usual immediacy. His enhanced senses, so keen moments before, blurred at the edges. The sound of battle became a smear, individual impact drowned in a rising thrum. "What have you done, Spider?" Lucius hissed. Within his body, things woke. Fail-safes buried in newly grafted organs flickered to life. Minuscule reservoirs, nestling against arteries and nerve trunks, released their contents in precise doses. Nanosyringes he had not known he carried pierced inner tissue. Exotic pharmacological chains flowed into his bloodstream, seeking receptor sites mapped long ago in the primogenitor's notes. He had taken Fabius's gifts willingly. He had trusted that he could master them, bend them, make them his own. He had never truly believed the spider would resist weaving a leash through every improvement. His legs locked. He tried to move, to twist, to raise his sword. Muscles that had surged moments before now seized like cooling metal. His armor's servos whined in protest as instructions screamed along the new nerve paths and met the chemical wall rising to greet them. He did not fall. The injection patterns were too finely tuned for that. He remained upright, balanced, every sense still open. He could see the Drukhari closing, could hear the cohors roaring as they realized their own betrayals, could smell ozone and blood. He simply could not move, not entirely. Lines of command remained open for breathing, for eye movement, for speech. The paralysis was surgical, allowing maximum awareness with minimum ability to resist. In his chest, his two hearts hammered behind their ribcage lattice. He could feel both. He could feel everything. Around him, Astartes froze mid-swing, mid-step. One brother locked in the act of wrenching a Drukhari's arm from its socket. The alien's face twisted in anticipation that turned to confusion when the blow did not finish. Another stood over a fallen foe, chains ward inches from the slender neck, teeth chattering uselessly. Some screamed. Some tried to tear their helmets off with hands that would not obey. Others laughed, high and sharp, their minds snapping at the sudden inversion from empowerment to helplessness. The Xenos saw it. Drukhari flowed back for a heartbeat, wary of some new trick, then surged forward with shrieks of delighted comprehension. They swarmed over immobilized Astartes, hook chains whipping out to snag limbs, collars snapping around throats. Those who attempted to bite or butt their captors were rewarded with stinging blows and the ecstatic giggles of alien torment. Mortals fared worse. The stolen crew, the vat-born thralls, Fabius's own expendable attendants who had served aboard the cruiser were not bound by the same precise locks, but they had no chance. Drukhari weapons tore into them, dissolving flesh, scattering bone. Few of them were taken alive. The dark kin had not come for their like. Their screams were mere background music. Lucius fought the paralysis with all his will, clawing at the chemchains with rage and the thin, serrated edge of his patron's favor. The curse that made him a paradox should have protected him. He had survived betrayal and death too many times to accept this silent binding. He forced a finger to twitch, then another. A Drukhari warrior darted in, seeing him still, assuming him helpless. The Xenos raised twin blades, intending to carve his faceplate open. Lucius poured every ounce of defiance into that failing limb, into the servos at his wrist. The faultless blade moved. The cut was slower than any he had made in centuries, but it was still enough. The Xenos staggered back from the unexpected strike, mask split, a dark slick running down its breastplate. It shrieked, enraged more by the disruption of perfection than the wound itself. Lucius tried to press the advantage, but the brief burst of movement exhausted what sliver of muscular control he had wrested from the chemical net. His sword arm dropped again, hanging limp at his side. They came at him in numbers then. Splinter rounds impacted his armor at close range, their toxins redundant against Astartes' physiology, but painful regardless. Nets of shimmering energy flared as they were thrown, wrapping around his limbs, tightening. Each strand carried a field that buzzed along his nerves, adding a layer of unnatural numbness. A whip flicked out, its length studded with hooks that bit into the gaps of his plate. It snapped tight, anchoring him as a group of raiders braced and pulled. Even immobilized, his mass was colossal. They strained, boots scraping, until some hidden grav device kicked in and dragged him forward in a series of jerks. He roared, not in plea, but in pure, wordless hatred. Other cohorts fell into the same captivity. Those whose implants had been less intense, whose bodies had fought the paralysis more effectively, managed a few more blows, a few more kills, before being drowned in a flood of neurotoxins and stasis fields. Cassian vanished under a tangle of Drukhari, his one good eye burning with fury, until a helm was jammed over his head. Viewports darkened from the outside. The corridors of the strike cruiser were transformed from battlefields into abattoirs and assembly lines. Xenos crews moved with practiced efficiency, separating those they wanted intact from those left to clutter the floors. Astartes were bound in barbed shackles, their armors fused to their restraints. Thicker chains, linked to anti-grav pallets, were looped around torsos and waists. Into this walked Fabius Bile. He came aboard through one of the new wounds in the hull, stepping delicately over twisted metal and tumbled bodies. A personal shield flickered around him, catching stray drips and motes of burning dust. His boots left no print in the fluid smeared on the deck. At his side moved a figure wrapped in a cloak of sewn skin, its proportions wrong in ways that spoke of broken bones and reconstructed joints. Fingers like jointed needles emerged from the folds, flexing with apparent curiosity. A homunculus of the Dark City, one of the ancient flesh-crafters. "You see," Fabius said conversationally to his Xenos counterpart, "it is as I promised. Minimal damage to the goods. A touch of theater, certainly, but the cores are intact. You would hardly wish for them to arrive unblooded." The homunculus made a clicking sound, the Drukhari equivalent of a thoughtful hum. "They are strong," it admitted, voice like air hissing through small holes. "Their pain is bright. Your tonic has preserved them in an exquisite moment of awareness. They cannot move, yet they feel. This pleases me." "It pleased me to design it," Fabius replied. "Your city's coin will please me further, and the toys you have brought, of course." He paused beside one of the restrained Astartes, a warrior Lucius half recognized by armor glyphs. The man glared out from behind his visor, muscles straining uselessly. "Do not scowl so," Fabius chided. "You wanted war. You will have it, in a fashion. The arenas of Comora are battlefields of a particular kind. You will be seen. Your suffering will be appreciated by connoisseurs." He moved on. When he reached Lucius, he stopped. The faultless blade hung in his bonds like a crucified idol, chains and energy nets binding his limbs, helm forced, back against a column. Faces writhed across his armor, shrieking silently at the proximity of the man who had threaded new nerves through their prison. Fabius regarded him for a long heartbeat. "Ah, Lucius," he said softly. "You prove as instructive in captivity as in apparent freedom." Lucius forced words through a throat that felt as if it had been filled with sand. "Traitor," he rasped. Fabius clicked his tongue. "We long since passed the point where that word has sting between us," he said. "You betrayed more oaths than most men could conceive before the walls of your precious palace ever fell. I break a bargain with you now, as I have broken countless others. What of it? You sold me, Lucius managed. You sold my cohors, like slaves, like livestock. I traded you, Fabius corrected, in exchange for knowledge, for artifacts, for access. You think yourself above commerce because you fancy yourself art. You are both. You are a masterpiece and a commodity. That is the joke the galaxy plays on all of us. The homunculus drifted closer, head twisting as it examined Lucius up and down. Its eyes were glossy black orbs, reflecting the Astartes back as a distorted figure. This one smells wrong, it murmured. He carries echoes, faces in his skin. I have heard of such a thing. The curse is part of his charm, Fabius said. Treat him with some care at first. If you damage the pattern too badly, you may ruin the effect. I would be most displeased if my future observations were cut short. The homunculus's lips peeled back from needle teeth. We will savor him, it promised. Many times. Lucius would have lunged for them both if he could. He would have wrapped his hands around Fabius's withered throat and squeezed until the primogenitor's eyes bulged and his mechanical harness screeched. He would have torn the homunculus limb from spindle limb and painted the walls with whatever served the dark kin as blood. Instead, he hung in his bonds and breathed, feeling every barb, every field, every chemical in his veins. He memorized them, committed each sensation to the ledger of his rage. Fabius reached out, almost gently, and tapped a finger against the armor over Lucius's breast. Do not disappoint me, he said. You are going to do remarkable things for my research. Try to make it interesting. He turned away, calling out instructions to servitors and Drukhari alike, overseeing the process as if directing the loading of equipment rather than the capture of legends. Barbed stasis coffins were brought in, grotesque things of wraithbone and steel, lined with restraints and line channels designed to carry both fluid and energy. One by one, Astartes were maneuvered into them, chains tightened, clasps locked. Fields hummed to life as lids descended, leaving only narrow transparencies through which the prisoners could see slivers of the world. Lucius felt the coffin close around him. Needles pricked through armor, biting into skin, sinking with the chemical web already in place. Cold seeped into his limbs as partial suspension wrapped his body. His mind remained horribly clear. He saw, through the narrowing gap, Fabius's emaciated form striding alongside the homunculus, conversing amiably. You will find the combat drugs I have prepared for you quite inspirational, the primogenitor was saying. Custom-tailored for Astartes' physiology, they will burn hot and brief, but what flames they will stoke. In return, the homunculus replied, the Coven grants you leave to walk certain paths in the Shadow City. You will not be flayed on sight. This is more courtesy than we show most Mon Ki. I am touched, Fabius said dryly. Truly. The lid sealed. Lucius hung in dimness, senses muffled but not extinguished. The steady thrum of the cruiser's engines shifted as foreign grav hooks latched on. There was a wrenching sensation as Drukhari raiders adjusted course, dragging their prize toward a tear in reality opening ahead. Through his narrow viewing slit, he saw it. The webway portal flowered in the void, a wound of colors that made the warp look sane. Light bent around its edges, forming impossible angles. Within, there was motion, like the beating of a colossal heart made of glass and knives. The Xenos vessels turned toward it, their sails flaring. The captured cruiser groaned as it was tugged along, still bound, still bleeding atmosphere from a dozen wounds. Off to one side, at a measured distance, a smaller ship held position. The Spider's vessel. Its silhouette was familiar from the corpse ring station, a patchwork of grafted hulls and extrusions, a tumor that had learned to swim. It drifted with deceptive languor, watching. In one of its viewports, Fabius stood.
Remember, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support helps.
Lucius could not see the details at this range, but he knew. He could feel the man's gaze like the touch of a scalpel. He understood then, with a clarity that cut deeper than any blade, the full measure of the betrayal. He was not merely cargo, he was experiment. The spider had set him upon a path designed from the start to end behind Xenos bars, so that the primogenitor could observe what an eternal duelist became when fed into the machinery of the Dark City. Cold fury filled him. It was not the hot, flaring wrath of the battlefield, but something denser, purer. It sank into his bones, into the scars on his skin, into the soul screaming in his armor. "I will remember," he whispered, the words barely sound, yet carrying all the weight of oath. "I will carve my way out of whatever pit you have sold me to, Spider. I will walk your station again one day, and when I do, I will make your death something worth studying." The raiders accelerated, dragging their chained prize toward the waiting wound. The last thing Lucius saw of normal space before the colors folded. In on themselves was the distant, receding shape of the primogenitor's ship turning away, engines flaring as it angled back toward the raw brilliance of the eye. The webway swallowed the Drukhari fleet whole. The screams of the cohors Nasicae, muffled by stasis fields and coffins of wraithbone, faded into the vibration of alien corridors as the Dark City drew its new champions toward its heart. Lucius woke to the sound of screaming stone. For a moment he thought it was his armor, the souls within raising their pitch in some new chorus. Then he realized the noise came from outside him, from the very bones of the place in which he lay chained. The floor beneath his back was not metal, but some strange hybrid of wraithbone and blackstone, veined with iridescent channels that pulsed faintly with alien light. Chains had grown from it like roots, barbs sunk deep into his armor and the flesh beneath, holding him down as securely as any forge weld. Above him, the ceiling curved away, a lattice of sharpened ribs between which flickered the dim glow of distant lumens. Voices echoed through the spaces, cries of pain that had long since worn away anything so simple as plea, laughter like blades drawn slowly, a constant susurration of whispered wagers. He turned his head. Movement returned in increments, like a machine restarting after long disuse. Fabius's chems had held him for a while even here, their careful balances jostled by whatever mechanisms the Drukhari favored. Now, sensation came rushing back down the stolen pathways, every nerve reminding him it existed. The barbs in his limbs flared, each point a sharp star in the constellation of his body. Beyond the bars of his confinement, the Dark City waited. The cell gate was a fusion of wraithbone and barbed adamantium, its surface grown and forged in equal measure. Through its narrow gaps, Lucius saw other cages stretching in concentric rings around a central void. Warriors hung from them like ornaments, some slumped, some straining. Between the cages, bridges and gantries of impossible geometry twisted, carrying figures in sleek armor or in chains. Beyond the immediate confines rose a greater structure, a satellite of Comara, orbiting an unseen mass of deeper darkness. The air here tasted of blood, strange spices, and something electric that set the teeth on edge. Everything was lit in lurid hues, ultraviolet flares, washes of poisonous green, fire the color of bruises. To one side, he glimpsed what passed for the flesh markets of the Dark City. Stalls of bone and skin drooped in sick parody of mercantile order. Mortal slaves dangled from hooks, their bodies flayed in careful patterns, muscles and tendons displayed as if for a student's examination. Some still lived, twitching gently in response to the attentions of cloaked homunculi, their nerves plucked like instrument strings. Xenos beasts, stitched together from disparate species, paced in cages too small, their eyes, gilded, their teeth capped with jewel-tipped spikes. On raised platforms, broken astartes were displayed like trophies. Their armor had been nailed open, their limbs spread in cruciform or more inventive poses. Some had been hollowed out and filled with growing gardens of thorns and parasitic fungi that glowed softly. Others had been turned into living thrones for Drukhari nobles, spines twisted into seats, mouths serving as cup holders. Lucius took it in with the dispassionate attention of a duelist studying a new opponent. The horror of it did not shock him. He had seen the works of the covens before, in whispers and peripheral glimpses. What interested him was the precision. Every cut, every display, every arrangement was calculated for effect. Excess here was neither random nor crude. It was curated. He became aware of breathing close by. Turning his head the other way, he saw that his own cell was not solitary. Chains linked him to others lying in restraints, spaced around the circular chamber. Some were silent, eyes closed, lips moving in private liturgies to fallen primarchs or faiths long abandoned. Others muttered, laughed, or wept. He recognized the heraldry of several traitor legions in the half-light. Baroque remnants of the Emperor's children, their colors dulled and overwritten by Drukhari scrawl. Iron warriors with their hazard striping torn and repainted, the chevrons edged in fresh scars. A son of the Eighth, his night-black plate studded with cruel spikes now bent inward, piercing his own flesh. There were black shields too, their plates stripped of identity, repainted in crude, desperate schemes that spoke of oaths broken and reforged in isolation. Each wore his anonymity, like both shame and freedom. Closest to him lay a knot of figures whose armor once had been vibrant in the hues of their shared god. Now those colors were muted under layers of grime and graffito. They wore the signs of the Lucid Circle, a splinter cult of noise, Marines. Sonic weaponry was clamped around their heads and limbs, not to be wielded, but to be endured. Feedback loops hummed through them, the instruments turned inward, making their own senses a constant torment. One of them shook, froth spattering from the edges of his clamped mouthpiece. The sound that leaked through was less a voice than a modulated wail, rising and falling in patterns that would have enthralled a Slaaneshi congregation, and here served only as background noise to Drukhari commerce. "Lucid Circle," Lucius said, his vox picking up the words and amplifying them from his helm grill, though his throat was raw. "So the spider's net caught you as well." The nearest of the Sonic Marines turned his head slowly. Behind the lenses of his helm, Lucius fancied he saw recognition. "Faultless," the other rasped, the word distorted by the clamps. "They wanted music. They will have it." Lucius made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "They will," he said, though not always the notes they expect. Footsteps approached along the curving walkway outside the cells, light and deliberate, accompanied by the jingle of chains and the purr of grav motors. A clutch of Drukhari pitmasters came into view, their armor a riot of hooks and gemstones. Masks concealed their features, each stylized into some cruel aspect. A leering skull, a flayed face, a serene visage with rows of razored teeth where lips should be. Behind them drifted a platform bearing a Vox amplifier cluster, its surface carved into sharp angles. Spidery limbs extended from its underside, each ending in a sensory node or a torture device. A helm-mounted grill on the foremost pitmaster flared as he spoke, his words echoing through the chamber. "Wake, Mon Kay," he called, voice dripping with humor. "Wake, slaves of failed gods. The arenas of the Dark City hunger, and your time in the larders is done." Cells snapped open in sequence, their gates folding back with organic clicks. Chains retracted from some of the prisoners, leaving them free to stand, though many staggered as circulation returned. Other chains remained, attaching collars, linking wrists, leashes trailing behind like mocking tails. Lucius felt the barbs at his limbs loosen. He rolled his shoulders, testing the range of movement. Enough to walk, enough to fight, not enough to break free yet. Not here. A hook pole jabbed into the gap between his pauldron and gorget. "Up, little champion," the masked Drukhari crooned. "The crowd has waited. They have heard songs of you. Let us see if you sing true." They led him along the walkway, chains taut. Other Astartes were dragged after him, some snarling, some silent. The lucid circle howled through their clamps, the frequencies making the very stone vibrate. Drukhari overseers flicked pain stims into uncooperative muscles, delighting in every involuntary twitch. As they moved, the wider vista of the satellite unfolded. Bridges arched over yawning pits filled with blades or coiled serpents. Towers of bone and alloy rose to vanish into the haze above, their sides studded with viewing platforms. Galleries lined the interior, tier upon tier of seating for those who had come to watch. Cabalite nobles lounged behind shimmering shields, their armor lacquered in colors that hurt the eyes, helms crafted to resemble predatory beasts or stylized skulls. Wyches clustered near the front rows, lithe forms twitching with anticipation, hands resting on the hilts of barbed blades and razor flails. The noise grew as Lucius emerged into full view of the arena. It was not a single flat space, but a series of shifting terraces and platforms, some rising, some sinking, all connected by narrow causeways. Wraithbone growths curled up from the floor to form obstacles or cages. At its heart yawned a pit lined with spikes, above which hovered suspended platforms held in place by invisible fields. Sound hit him like a physical blow, shrieking, chanting, the throb of drums fashioned from stretched skin, the wail of tortured instruments. Lights flared, casting the entire space in alternating washes of sickly green, bruise purple, and raw scarlet. The pitmasters marched him to a central dais. A vox node descended above him, its tendrils flaring as it drew in his outline. "Behold!" the announcing Drukhari cried, voice amplified 100-fold. "Behold, denizens of the dark city! Behold our newest toy, freshly purchased from the spider who feasts upon your discarded experiments." A ripple of laughter greeted the mention of Fabius. They knew him here. They feared and respected him in their way. A rival predator. "This is the one they name the Faultless Blade," the announcer went on. "This is the duelist of Chemos, the champion of the Primarch of Excess, the one who dies and wears his killer's face. Fulgrim's favorite madness, dragged here to dance for you." The roar from the crowd was deafening. Names and curses and wagers flew out over the arena. Lucius raised his head. He did not bow. He did not acknowledge them as master or audience. He simply stared up at the tiers of writhing bodies, at the homunculi watching from high boxes, their long fingers steepled, and let his contempt simmer. "If you wanted a god to worship, you should have said," he called back, letting his helm's vox carry the words. "I would have dressed for the occasion." The jeers pleased the crowd all the more. The chains fell away. The first opponent stepped onto the sand. It was a thing of Comarug's making, a beast stitched together from too many predators. The lower body was that of some great-scaled creature, four-legged and sinuous. The upper torso had once been human, rippling with muscle now bound in barbed chain, extra arms grafted on at odd angles, each clutching a different weapon, a cleaver, a hook length of chain, a weighted flail. Its head was a carapaced horror, mandibles clicking, eyes glittering with borrowed malice. Lucius drew the faultless blade. The duel was short, brutal, and beneath him. The creature lunged with animal fury, guided by whatever sadist in the coven had thought to balance it. He slid aside from its first charge, boots finding purchase on sand slicked with old blood. The second charge he met with a cut that took one hybrid shoulder. A third, fouled, left it open, and in that heartbeat he ended it, slipping under flailing limbs to drive his sword through the weak point where stitched flesh met armor carapace. The crowd applauded, but with a note of disappointment. They had expected more from their new toy. They gave him more. After that came rival champions. An orc knob fitted with an elaborate shock collar, roaring as pain drove it ever forward, choppers hacking in wide arcs. A Kroot mercenary band, its members modified with extra spurs and feeding crests, their rifles replaced by long knives. A human gladiator whose body had been refined through centuries of survival, his muscles like wire, his eyes dead and cold as he moved through forms that might once have been Imperial Guard, close combat drills twisted into something much deadlier. Lucius killed them all. Every bout he felt the eyes on him, not just those of the cheering crowds, but the colder gazes of homunculi seated in shadowed boxes. They leaned forward when he took a wound, when he pushed himself, when his movements slowed. They whispered to one another as his armor drank fresh souls, as the scars on his skin crawled in response to the heat of battle. Once, in a pause between opponents, he looked up and saw Fabius among them. The primogenitor stood in a guest box, surrounded by a small retinue. The Drukhari around him regarded him as one might regard a dangerous animal allowed at court for amusement. He wore no cloak to hide his harness, his mechadendrites twitching in rhythm with the spectacle below. He held a data slate, and even now his fingers tapped notes into it. Their gazes met. Fabius inclined his head a fraction, in acknowledgement or mockery. Lucius could not tell. He bared his teeth behind his helm. The death that truly delighted them came later. They sent out a witch champion, a lithe killer whose armor was a second skin of blades. It moved with impossible grace, every step a dance, every breath synchronized with the throbbing music pounding through the arena. Its weapons were slender, delicate-looking things that sang as they cut the air. Lucius went to meet it with all his usual contempt. They traded blows in dazzling flurries. The witch danced around his greater mass, leaping off walls, flipping from hanging chains, always just out of reach. Its blades flashed, leaving bright lines across his armor where they kissed ceramite. He felt some go deeper, touching the flesh beneath, each contact a jolt of cold fire. His own cuts were fewer, but heavier. He scored the alien's side, carving a line through armor to the pale skin under. He sheared away part of its helm, revealing an eye that burned with hate and joy. The crowd was a solid wall of sound around them. At some signal he did not hear, the music shifted. A new rhythm wormed its way into his bones. For a heartbeat, his footwork faltered, his timing thrown by the unfamiliar beat. The witch had waited for that moment. It was commerate to its core. It understood the manipulation of sensation as weapon. It slid inside his guard like a whisper. Blades punched under his arm, between plates. Another pair raked across his throat, finding the soft seals there. Pain flared, hot and immediate. Lucius staggered as strength left one arm. Blood filled his mouth. He saw, through a red haze, the exquisite delight on the witch's half-revealed face as it realized it had him, as it tasted the ecstasy of besting the famed faultless blade in front of the dark city. It laughed. He fell. The world narrowed to a tunnel of color and sound. He felt his heart stutter, then slow. He felt his lungs spasm. The sand rushed up to meet his cheek. His armor screamed, the trapped souls within rising in a pandemonium that drowned out the crowd. Somewhere, the Drukhari announcer shouted his supposed end, his voice cracking with glee. Bets were paid out, debts collected, riots of amusement and disappointment playing out in the stands. The witch stood over him, raising its weapons in salute, drinking in the adulation. It basked in it, eyes closed, arms spread wide. Lucius knew that feeling. He had lived for it. He felt the familiar shift, inevitable as a falling blade. The curse pulsed. It was not a thing he controlled. It had its own logic, its own hunger. He felt it reach out, wrapping around that moment of triumph, that spike of monstrous joy. It sank hooks into the witch's elation, into the thought that whispered, "I killed Lucius the Eternal." The alien convulsed. At first, the crowd thought it part of the performance. The champion spasmed, back arching, weapons slipping from nerveless fingers. Its laughter turned to a strangled cry. Armor buckled and warped, as if something beneath were pushing outward. The exposed eye bulged, iris warping, color bleaching toward a familiar pale. Flesh flowed. Bones shifted under skin, reconfiguring. Limbs lengthened, musculature swelling beyond lithe elegance toward heavier, Astartes proportions. The helm cracked further, revealing features that were no longer Drukhari and not yet human, caught in a grotesque in-between. The champion clawed at its own face, as if trying to tear the transformation away. Lucius fell through darkness and rose. He was standing again. His viewpoint stuttered, then stabilized. The angle was wrong for a heartbeat, the world viewed from an unfamiliar height and sway. Then the curse finished its work, hammering identity into flesh, and he was once more himself, helmed, armored, the faultless blade in his hand. At his feet lay a corpse in twisted alien plate, its face a warped echo of the witch's last expression, frozen mid-scream. No one who had not seen the change would have recognized it, but the scent of it clung. The residue of the dark city's darling turned to discard. Silence swept the arena. Then, as comprehension rippled outward, pandemonium. The crowd howled, some in disbelief, others in frenzied joy. Bets were recalculated at insane odds as bookmakers tried desperately to adjust. Homunculi leaned so far over their box rails that lesser Drukhari backed away in fear of being touched. Even Fabius, up in his chosen vantage, laughed aloud, the sound lost in the storm, but real all the same. Lucius spread his arms, blood still dripping from wounds that were already knitting. His helm's vox amplified his voice to a roar. "Did you think a little death would keep me?" he shouted. "I am Lucius. I am the duel. I am the sin in the killing stroke. You cannot steal what I am. You can only feed it." The legend of the eternal gladiator was born in that moment. After that, the cycles blurred. He died many times that season, at the hands of beasts, at the points of finely wrought blades, under hails of carefully modulated fire. He died to amuse bored nobles, to settle bitter feuds between cabals, to test new toxins and pain engines. Each time, the one who took joy in ending him screamed as their own features twisted into his. Each time, another corpse bearing his armor and name sank into the sand, and another rose from among their killers. The Drukhari wagered fortunes on how many deaths he would rack up before the season's end. They bet on who would earn the dubious honor of being his next vessel. The odds grew ever more convoluted, taking into account streaks of success, styles of killing, and the inscrutable whims of chaos. Between bouts, he hung in chains once more. The cells became both cage and council chamber. The cohors nasicae, those of them who had survived the initial capture and the subsequent cull in the arenas, gathered what fragment of identity remained around him. Cassian spoke little, but his single eye burned with a slow, banked fire. The lucid circle pulsed with distorted hymns. Their suffering turned into weapons, even against their own despair. Lucius mapped everything. He counted guard rotations by the footfalls on the walkways, by the cadence of shouted insults. He learned which gates opened at which times, which corridors led to staging pits, which elevators to homunculi laboratories. He noted which cabals favored which days, the patterns of nobles' attendance, the subtle shifts in the city's distant rumble that presaged shifts in power. He whispered to those around him when the pitmasters grew bored and wandered. He told tales of past glories, not as boast, but as reminder that there had been life beyond these cages. He promised revenge in measured tones, not the wild. Vows of broken men, but the cold assurances of one who fully intended to make good on every syllable. "You can die here," he told a Black Shield who stared at the floor as if it might open and swallow him. "You can sink into the sand and let the dark city drink you, or you can watch, learn, wait. When the time comes, I will not walk out of this alone. I will need blades at my back. You can be one of them if you remember that you are more than their toy." The Black Shield looked up slowly, something like hope flickering behind the grime on his faceplate. In the high boxes, deals were made over his performances. Homunculi compared notes with the primogenitor, their voices a susurration of technical terms and delighted cruelty. They spoke of the curse in clinical language, stripping it of romance. They argued over whether the transformation was complete annihilation of the previous self, or some melding of residual threads. They debated the possibility of trapping the process, mid-change, of catching Lucius in a half-born state and dissecting him there. Fabius listened, always listened, absorbing their conjectures and adding his own. "If we can isolate the trigger," he said once, his voice barely audible beneath the din, but captured by the glyph wards that carried sound between boxes, "we might be able to induce it without the need for lethal combat. Imagine a controllable field of transference, a curse that can be turned on and off." "And then sold," the homunculus replied, its amusement evident. "You remain a merchant at heart, Spider. You would make a weapon of anything." "Of course," Fabius said. "What else is there worth making?" If Lucius heard that, it only added another notch to the tally he kept for the primogenitor. The season's climax came in a spectacle designed to outdo all that had come before. The arena floor reconfigured, platforms grinding up from below, bridges swinging into new alignments. Cages hung from chains, some empty, some already rattling with whatever horrors waited inside. The stands were packed, every tier crammed with Drukhari, eager to witness whatever excess their pitmasters had concocted. Cabal banners fluttered in the stale air. Coven sigils glowed. Even distant archons had sent representatives. Lucius stood alone in the center, armor still bearing traces of previous fights, some by design rather than necessity. The scars told a story, and the Dark City loved stories. The announcer's voice rose over the bedlam. "People of Comora," it cried, "behold the culminating folly of this cycle. Behold the eternal gladiator, Fulgrim's fallen son, who has died more times than your tutors can count, and refuses to stay in his grave." The crowd howled. "Today," the voice went on, "he will face not one champion, nor two, nor any simple monster from our menageries. Today, he will face teams of witches from rival cults, beasts from the far reaches of the webway, constructs of bone and blade. Today we will see if there is any limit to this Monkey's refusal to die." Gates crashed open. Wyches spilled out, a dozen lithe forms in armor that gleamed like beetle shells, each bearing different weapons, razor flails, shard nets, glaives that crackled with captured lightning. Behind them came beasts, clawed things with too many eyes, towering brutes whose skin writhed with embedded parasites, serpentine horrors that left trails of freezing vapor. Lucius rolled his shoulders. The stim ports along his spine, gifts of the spider, pulsed faintly as the arena's systems fed them a carefully moderated dose. His nerves sharpened, his vision tightened, the world narrowing to each potential kill around him. He thought of the web that had brought him here, of Fabius's station, of the strike cruiser's betrayal, of the Drukhari's chains and knives. He thought of every time he had fallen and risen, every scream that had fed his curse. He thought of Comora itself, the festering jewel of the webway, and of the story he intended to write in its blood. Then he moved. What followed was a blur, even to him. He met the first wave of witches in a clash of styles, their flowing, acrobatic violence crashing against his precise, relentless brutality. He cut through a razor flail blur, edges catching and snapping. He stepped past a shard net cast, wrapping its weighted cords around the throat of a beast and dragging it into the path of a charging construct. He vaulted a low sweep, boots finding the back of a serpentine horror, riding it for a heartbeat before dropping into the midst of another cluster of foes. His enhanced reflexes sang. Every cut of his blade was a line on a score, every parry a corrective note. He used the arena itself, driving enemies into the paths of swinging cages, onto rising platforms, into each other's weapons. Drukhari blood spattered the sand, mingling with whatever passed for ichor in their pets. The crowd went mad. They shrieked every time he took a hit that would have felled a lesser being. They screamed his borrowed name every time he rose from under a pile of bodies. They beat the railings, some slashing their own flesh in excitement, the scent of their spilling lives, adding yet another layer to the heady blend in the air. He lost count of the kills. In the end, he stood alone on a platform surrounded by corpses and twitching remnants, his armor scored and dented, his breathing harsh in his own ears. The faultless blade dripped, its edge still flawless. The arena around him was a ruin, its carefully arranged structures broken, its devices jammed with clogged meat and shattered wraithbone. He looked up. They chanted for more. "Lucius!" they howled. "Eternal! Eternal! Eternal!" The word echoed off the rising tiers, bounced from bone to stone, wrapped itself around the high boxes where homunculi and primogenitor watched. It rang in his armor, in his cursed flesh, in the deep recesses of his mind where pride and hatred coiled together. He realized in that moment what this place was. Not just a prison, an anvil. Every death, every rebirth, every cut and cheer and note of Drukhari song was hammer blow and quenching. They were forging him, not into their toy, but into something harder, something honed. They thought they owned his story now, that the arenas of Commorragh would define him. He smiled beneath his helm. "Keep watching," he whispered, so low only the souls in his armor heard. "You are not the first to think you can make use of me. You will not be the last, but I promise you this, Dark City." He lifted his sword in salute, playing the part they expected, bathing in the roar. "When I leave this pit," he murmured inside the storm, "I will carry your screams with me, and what is forged here will cut more than you ever intended." They sang his name across the dark city. Lucius heard it in the shriek of the vox wails that laced the satellite spires, in the drumming of skinned fists on bone railings, in the hissed wages of Kabbalite nobles as they traded slaves and memories. His silhouette had been carved into wraithbone columns, his mask hammered into trophy walls. The arenas called him their eternal, their faultless gladiator, their favorite lie about death. For a full season of killing and resurrection, he had bled for them and refused to stay gone. No beast, no witch cult, no stitched abomination or humiliated champion had managed to keep him down. Every time his curse took a new vessel, every time he rose from a corpse that had once exulted in his fall, the legend swelled. The Drukhari loved legends almost as much as they loved suffering. Now the satellite's primary arena roared his title as if it were a prayer. He stood at its heart, sand and broken wraithbone crunching under his boots, armor smeared in the drying remnants of the last spectacle. Corpses ringed. The platforms, some still twitching as parasites or hidden devices worried at their remnants. Overhead, galleries heaved with bodies, a rain of gemstones and blood droplets falling from the more enthusiastic spectators. The announcer's voice cut through it all, magnified by cruel engines. "Commorragh," it cried, "bow your sharpened heads to your undefeated champion. Behold Lucius, the eternal blade, the godling of the third, the toy that refuses to break." They howled for him, for his defiance, for his curse, for the next time they could watch him die and rise anew. He raised his sword and basked in it, not as praise, but as raw material. Every scream fed his pride. Every jeer and chant added weight to the story he was forging from this pit. When the noise reached a fever pitch, the announcer gestured grandly toward a high balcony. A section of the arena wall shifted, bone and metal flowing like wax, forming a throne of hooked ribs and vertebrae. Upon it drifted an ancient homunculus, its form swathed in a robe of stitched faces, each one stretched into a different expression of agony. At the creature's gesture, attendants brought forth a shape, concealed beneath a shroud of flayed skin, the membrane twitching as if trying to escape whatever lay beneath. As reward for his performance, the homunculus intoned, its voice thin and sharp as a knife's edge. The arenas of the Dark City grant our favorite Monkey a gift, a relic of Comora's art, a frame of battle to match his appetite. Clawed hands tore the shroud away. The thing revealed was a harness, an exoskeletal frame fashioned from blackened metal and polished bone. It resembled the ribcage of some vast predator, inverted and hinged, designed to clasp around a warrior's torso and spine. From its arching limbs sprouted injector spines, each tipped with a different colored droplet, clinging to the needle point. Ampules of venom and stimulant hung from its edges like obscene jewels, each vial held in place by delicate hooks of wraithbone etched with complex sigils. It hummed with restrained malice. "This," the homunculus hissed, "is a stim frame, a gift from our coven's vaults. It will seat itself along your spine, little champion. It will drink your nerves and bleed alchemical ecstasy into your veins. At your whim, it will make time slow and sensation burn like stars. You will be faster, stronger, slighter, closer to being worth our interest." The crowd shrieked approval. Lucius regarded the device. He could feel its aura from here, a cold curiosity reaching for his own. It reminded him of the first time he had seen a chainsword, years before he wore plate, the way the teeth had spun and begged for flesh. From another balcony, Fabius Bile stepped into view. The primogenitor wore a cloak of wired flesh over his armor, alchemical harness gleaming, mechadendrites coiled. He looked, as ever, like a cadaver that refused to lie down. Drukhari withdrew slightly from his proximity as an instinct, even those who considered themselves friends. His reputation was a weight in this city. He had walked its alleys as subject, rival, and bargain maker both. An elegant piece, he called, voice carrying on hidden amplifiers. Crude in some respects, of course, but the principles are sound. The coven has outdone itself. High praise from a thief of genes, the homunculus answered, with something that might have been amusement. Will you assist in fitting our toy? You have studied his inside so often, it would be uncharitable not to invite you. I would be delighted, Fabius said. He looked down at Lucius, lenses catching the arena's sickly light. What say you, faultless one? He asked. Shall we see how far your nerves can be stretched before they snap? The crowds demand fresher wonders. You would not wish to bore them. Lucius met his gaze through the helm lenses. You have already threaded my spine with your curiosities, he said, letting scorn sharpen his tone. What is one more parasite? Fit it, spider, then watch what I do with it. The homunculus gestured again. Chains snaked out from the arena floor, wrapping around Lucius's limbs and torso. Hooks caught in the joints of his plate with expert ease. There was no fight in him for this stage. Resistance here would gain nothing but additional scars. This was a tool being offered, even if it came on a leash. They hauled him down through a yawning aperture that opened beneath his feet, the sand receding as the frame surrounded him and lowered him into the bowels of the arena. The flesh lab smelled of cold meat and chemical roses. It was a cavernous space, carved from living wraithbone and grafted metals, lit by bioluminescent growths and harsh white globes. Racks of tools hung from the ceiling like stalactites of steel. Containers lined the walls, each holding things that twitched or pulsed in eerie synchrony. Surgical tables of bone and glass stood in neat rows, some occupied, some waiting. At the chamber's center rose a cruciform frame. They pinned him to it without ceremony, arms spread wide, legs shackled, armor locks overridden by devices that buzzed and whined. Plates parted along his back, opening like beetle wings, disgorging cable bundles and a glimpse of gene-forged musculature. Cold air kissed the exposed flesh, bringing with it the ghostly caress of filth and antiseptic. Lucius gritted his teeth behind the Vox grill. He had been on a frame like this before, on a different ship, under different lights. The memory of Fabius's table on a warship lost to the warp tickled the back of his mind like an old scar. Déjà vu, he said. Fabius appeared in his peripheral vision, hands already gloved, eyes bright behind thin lenses. "You should be honored," the primogenitor said. "Few specimens are given the chance to be improved by both Comora and myself. Consider this an apex of sorts." The homunculus drifted across from him, skeletal fingers flexing. "We will begin with the spinal interface," it said. "The frame must kiss every vertebra, drink from every nerve root, if it is to give proper song." "Yes," Fabius agreed. "Your chem channels run along these lines? Intriguing. There is scope here to mesh with the altered pathways I have already instated." They spoke over him as if he were a convenient map, tracing the lines of his back with cold instruments. Each touch sent ripples of sensation through his body, amplified by the spider's previous adjustments. He watched their hands, the gleam of metal and bone, with something that might have been curiosity, if not for the pain he knew would follow. The stim rack descended on articulated arms, its limbs flexing like a living thing tasting the air. Its injector spines glimmered, droplets at their tips catching the light, colors that belonged to no natural spectrum. "Hold him," the homunculus said. There was no need. The cruciform frame held him well enough. Servitor-like constructs emerged from recesses in the floor, their many limbs bearing clamps and saws and thin barbed wires. The first needle went in above his hips. It slid between opened plates with obscene delicacy, puncturing skin and slipping alongside the thick bundle of nerves that descended from his spine. Pain flared, bright and immediate. A star burst across his entire lower body. A voice escaped him then, not word, but a hiss that rasped through the vox. Another needle followed higher, and another, each seeking its own segment of bone and nerve. They drove their barbs into him with the precision of artisans threading jewels onto wire. Each new penetration added another layer to the burning web growing inside him. His vision blurred, then snapped tight again as his enhanced physiology fought to adjust. Fabius dictated as they worked. Heart rate elevated. "Beyond usual battle baseline," he said. "Both hearts engaged, neural activity spiking in the sensory cortex as expected. The prior modifications respond to the new probes with a resonance. Fascinating." The homunculus murmured responses, naming glands and nerve clusters in harsh consonants, suggesting small adjustments. "Overload thresholds must be pushed," it observed. "If he cannot dance on the edge of collapse, what is the point?" "Indeed," Fabius said. "Bring him to the brink, but not over. Not yet. His curse is tied to the manner of his death. I wish to see how near we can bring him without triggering transference." They probed deeper. Hooks on the inner surface of the rack dug into his shoulders, anchoring the exoskeleton firmly. More syringes slid into the flesh along his neck, the base of his skull. Each one tasted his blood, then began a slow drip of foreign substances, testing, calibrating. Chemical fire raced along his nerves, leaving after images of colors across his vision. Lucius clenched his jaw until his fangs ground. The shrieks of the bound souls in his armor climbed with his own sensation, rising in a layered keening that made the lab's instruments tremble. He felt his heart trip and stagger, then find new rhythms under the urging of injected stimulants. Time stretched. He did not know how long they kept him there, poised on that edge. Long enough that he felt his own identity flicker at the margins, old duels and death's whispering, tempted to bloom into full transference. Each time his mind approached that precipice, Fabius, or the homunculus, adjusted a dial, withdrew a fraction of the flow, eased him back from the border. "Note," Fabius said at one point, as Lucius's vision tunneled, "the way his scars crawl. The curse seeks an anchor. Without a killer exulting in the strike, it finds nothing to bind to. Emotion is not alone sufficient. There must be narrative shape, your obsession." "With story does you credit," the homunculus replied. "You would have made an interesting tormentor, Spider, had you been born in a better city." "I make do," Fabius said. Finally, mercifully or cruelly, the last injector spine sank home and sealed. The rack's limbs tightened, locking into the channels carved into his armor and flesh. Its weight settled onto him, not heavy in the simple sense, but present, an overlay on his every movement. The cruciform frame rotated, bringing him upright. Restraints released in stages, leaving him swaying on his own feet. His muscles trembled, not from weakness, but from the flood of new signals coursing through them. He took a step. The stim rack moved with him, its claws flexing subtly, its ampules chiming against one another. He could feel, at the edge of conscious thought, the presence of control nodes, a clench of certain muscle groups, a particular pattern of breath, a mental twist along familiar channels, and he knew he could trigger a cascade. Behind his helm, his lips curved. "It is done," the homunculus said, satisfaction creeping into its tone. "Our little blade has a new scabbard." Fabius circled him like a matra studying a dueling automaton. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Be honest, if you can manage the novelty." Lucius rolled his shoulders. The rack's hooks tugged faintly on his spine, a whisper running up and down it. The ampules at his back clinked like a choir of glass teeth. "Like a parasite," he said, "one that purrs when I think of blood." "Accurate," Fabius said. "Know this, Lucius. Every time you use it, you will burn a little cleaner. The chemicals will scour your nerves, heighten your responses, and at the same time, strip away whatever restraint you pretend to possess. Indulge it often enough, and you will become nothing but a reflex wrapped in scar tissue, a weapon with only one answer to every stimulus. Is that not what you have always wanted?" Lucius asked. "A perfect, predictable subject?" "Oh, hardly," Fabius said. "Predictable subjects are dull. But I am honest enough to tell you the price. Your patron, I suspect, will find the trade amusing. Less man, more duel, less thought, more act." Lucius laughed softly. "If you think you can frighten me with the prospect of becoming more devoted to the blade, Spider, then you have forgotten who you are speaking to." "I never forget," Fabius murmured. "I merely take notes." They returned him to the cages with little fanfare. His fellow captives fell silent as he passed, eyes drawn to the glimmer of the rack's frame where it protruded from beneath his plate. Some flinched away from the alien device. Others stared with hungry envy, imagining what they might do with such a thing. Back in his own cell, chains snaked out to anchor him as before. When they tightened, the rack tightened with them, settling. The first time he used it came sooner than expected. The arenas wanted immediate returns on their investment. No sooner had his body recovered enough to stand without tremor than the pitmasters came, unhooking him, dragging him once more up the winding paths to the central pit. The crowds were wilder than ever, sense of anticipation and spent pleasures thick in the air. He stepped onto the sand, the rack cold along his spine. A fresh array of opponents waited for him, a team of witches armed with paired blades that hummed with caged lightning, a pair of hulking beast constructs whose limbs ended in serrated wheels, and a towering figure in Baroque armor stripped from some fallen Astartes, now worn by a Drukhari champion like stolen skin. The announcer bellowed about new toys and higher stakes, about the Stimframe's first outing. Wagers soared. Lucius stood still for a long heartbeat, sword point resting lightly in the grit. He listened to his own breathing, to the hiss of the crowd, to the subtle clink and pulse at his back. Then he reached inward and touched the stim rack's controls. It did not require a button or a large theatrical gesture. It responded to intent, to the tightening of certain muscles, to a thought given the right shape. He let his mind brush the pattern the homunculus had whispered into his nerves, and felt the frame respond. Needles buried along his spine flexed. A tide of chemicals surged into his blood. Time did not truly slow, but his perception of it changed. The roar of the crowd stretched, every individual shout suddenly distinct, every heartbeat between drum impacts counted. The flex of muscle under alien armor, the flicker of tension in a witch's calf before a leap, the minute shift in a beast's weight as it prepared to charge, all unfolded in crystalline clarity before him. The world sharpened into a series of decision points. He moved. To the spectators, it must have looked as if he blurred. One moment he stood in apparent repose. The next, he was among the witches, blade carving a line through their formation. He saw their eyes widen behind their visors as they realized their timing was wrong, their vaunted speed insufficient. He slid between electrified edges, the hairs on his exposed skin prickling, and took a hand at the wrist, a foot at the ankle, a head at the neck. The beasts thundered toward him, limbs churning the sand. Their serrated wheels tore gouges in the arena floor. Lucius stepped between them, the stimrack's gifts letting him judge the exact moment when their arcs would intersect. He felt the wind of their passage on his helm and drove his sword into a seam of churning plates, wrenching, moving on before the construct had finished its stumble. Pain hit him too, brighter than before, every glancing blow a starburst. Where once he might have shrugged off a cut as trivial, now he felt every fiber parting, every impact lodging in bone. But the rack took that sensation and fed it back into his muscles as fuel, turning threat into drive, agony into a higher octave of focus. He laughed as he fought, not the sharp bark of mockery he had flung at Imperial champions, but a deeper, almost joyous sound. The stimrack whispered along his spine, urging him faster, promising more if he pushed further, if he drank deeper of what it offered. By the time the last opponent fell, the arena was a mess of ruin. The crowd stood in a single swaying wave, voices raw from screaming. Lucius stood at the center, chest heaving, armor ringing with the echo of blades. The chemicals still burned in his veins, his vision ringed in hazy light. Slowly, deliberately, he eased his grip on the rack's control pattern. The flow ebbed, leaving him hollowed and shaking. In that emptiness he felt the price Fabius had warned of. A sliver of restraint had been burned away, leaving behind a sharpened hunger. The idea of fighting without the frame's gifts felt suddenly dull. He filed that away with all the way. Other costs he had chosen to ignore over the centuries. Between bouts, in the quieter reaches of the cages, he used his new status as further leverage. The others had seen what the rack let him do. They had watched him move like the warp's own thought. They had seen the fear in even Drukhari eyes when he cut too close to their boxes. He gathered the remnants of his cohors and the most intact of the other captives around him when the pitmasters grew bored and wandered away. The lucid circles distorted hymns filled the background, a strange counterpoint to his low words. "You see now," he said, voice pitched for vox privacy. "They think this frame makes me more theirs. It does the opposite. It makes me more dangerous to them than ever." "You could cut a path through half the Cabal alone," Vardus muttered, chained at his side. "Half is not enough," Cassian said quietly. "The city is a maze of blades. We would drown in reinforcements before we reached even the nearest portal." "We will not be alone," Lucius replied. "The homunculi are not as united as they seem. The Cabals gnaw each other's flanks like hungry dogs. All we must do is choose the right moment to kick the fire. My new toy will open the first vein. Your guns, your blades, your screams will do the rest." He looked to the lucid circle. "They have turned your music inward," he said. "You can turn it outward again. You remember how. Their wraithbone is not invulnerable. It sings when it cracks." The nearest noise marine shuddered, clamps humming around his head. "We will make it sing," he rasped. "We will make it howl until the dark city shakes." Quietly, over many days and bleeding nights, a plan began to coalesce. Not a perfect one. Perfection was for sculpted marble and Primarch's speeches. This would be rough and loud and improvised, but it would be theirs. Later, alone in his cell, Lucius stood with his hands resting on the bars. The metal bit into his palms, leaving faint imprints. Beyond, the satellite's outer skin opened onto a carefully framed view of Comoros' greater mass. The dark city loomed like a nest of shattered knives, its spires spearing upward, its bridges webbing across gulfs that should not have held any structure. Lights pulsed along arteries of traffic, some the cold glare of engines, others the softer glow of open wounds in reality. Somewhere in that jagged expanse, Archons plotted, homunculi experimented, and the spider walked, gathering stories and samples. The stim rack lay along his back, a cold weight. He could feel the faint thrum of its dormant power, the restless stir of fluids in their ampules. His fingers twitched, almost of their own accord, seeking the familiar pattern that would trigger the flood. He did not indulge. Not yet. "The next time," he whispered, helm pressed to the bars, vox off, so the words were his alone. "It will not be for your cheers, not for their wages, not for the spider's notes." He closed his eyes briefly, seeing again the arena awash in shattered wraithbone and Drukhari bodies, but this time the exits were open and the slaves were running. "The next battle," he said, feeling the parasite along his spine purr as if in anticipation, "will not be for the crowd." His fingers tapped the control pattern once, then stopped. "It will be for freedom." The dark city trembled with anticipation. Across Comoros' labyrinth of spires and bridges, messages scuttled like spiders. Vox whales carried invitations and insults between cabals. Coven barges drifted along transit lanes thick with traffic, their hulls bristling with hung specimens and shrieking trophies. The gladiatorial satellite that housed Lucius's arena glowed more brightly than ever, its wraithbone veins pulsing in lurid colors as power was fed into its heart. Tonight would be a spectacle. In his cell beneath the killing grounds, Lucius sat chained to the floor, head bowed as if in contemplation. The stim rack lay cold along his spine, its claws nested in his bones. The souls in his armor murmured and hissed, tasting the rising tide of expectation that seeped even into this pit. Across from him, Cassian watched through the gloom, helm off, his one augmetic eye gleaming dully. "Tonight?" the veteran asked, voice barely more than a breath over the private Vox channel. Lucius raised his head, the scars on his face, a palimpsest of old duels and recent offerings, shifted as he stretched the skin. Slowly, as if merely easing a cramp, he drew his lower lip between his teeth and bit down. Blood welled. With a small jerk of his head, he smeared it upward, drawing a diagonal line through an existing pattern. To any Drukhari watcher, it was nothing, another scar among many. To those who had been listening to him whisper of timing and patterns in the long dark, it was a signal. Cassian dipped his chin once. In the adjoining cells, noise marines of the lucid circle twitched as the coded cut flashed in their lenses. Their restraints vibrated as they started to hum, testing the limits of their clamps. A black shield in dull, featureless plate-flexed shackled hands, rolling his shoulders as far as the chains allowed. Others, sons of scattered legions and broken oaths, straightened subtly, as if shrugging off a weight. Pitmasters came with their hook poles and barbed leashes, laughter thin and sharp behind their masks. They jabbed at Lucius's armor, shouting for him to move, calling him toy and spectacle and sweet meat. Chains retracted from the floor, leaving him standing, head bowed once more. He did not resist as they led him toward the ramps. Above, the arena roared. He heard it as he ascended, the sound growing from a distant rumble to a physical pressure. The passage walls trembled with the force of so many voices, with the bass throb of drums beaten on stretched skin, with the shriek of instruments that had once been living throats. The stim rack along his spine stirred, sensing his rising heart rate. The gates opened. Light hit him like a lash. The arena floor below was a shifting maze of platforms and pits, reconfigured yet again for this grand display. Spires of sharpened wraithbone jutted upward, some capped with cages, others with spinning blades or flame emitters that spat sheets of emerald fire. Above, galleries were crammed with Drukhari, their armor gleaming, helms and bare faces alike contorted in hungry anticipation. Banners of multiple cabals hung from the arches, their sigils glimmering. Coven glyphs pulsed in poisonous hues. Tonight, rival power blocks had set aside their private wars to witness this promised pinnacle of cruelty. "Comara!" the announcer shrieked from a hovering dais, its vox engines distorting the voice into a ragged scream. "Behold your eternal once more. Behold the Mon-Ki who mocks your blades and refuses your grave. Behold Lucius, the faultless, who will tonight either ascend to legend or be torn apart in such exquisite fashion that even his god will weep." They hauled him to the center of the sands and cast him forward. Chains snapped away, falling limp around his boots. He straightened, letting the arena see him. Armor scored and marked by a season of killing, face carved into a map of self-inflicted devotion, the alien silhouette of the stim rack jutting subtly from beneath his plate like a skeletal parasite. He looked up and slowly turned, taking in the stands. He saw homunculi in their boxes, hunched forms draped in flayed finery. He saw Archon representatives, their helms fashioned to resemble predators, their eyes cold as void. He saw witches coiled like venomous springs at the gallery's edges, the scent of their combat drugs thick even at this distance. He saw Fabius. The primogenitor occupied a balcony off to one side, lower than the homunculi but higher than most. Cabal seats. His harness glinted, mechadendrites coiled in expectant spirals. He held a slate in one hand, a goblet in the other. Around him, Drukhari attendants stood just beyond the reach of his tools. Lucius smiled behind his helm. "Watch closely, Spider," he murmured. Around the arena, gates opened. They vomited forth death. Cult teams of witches exploded onto the sand in a riot of motion, their armor colorful and obscene, their weapons a blur of hooks and flails and crackling blades. Pain engines lumbered behind them, grotesque constructs of meat and iron. Their screaming riders fused into their frames. Beast packs slithered and bounded, a menagerie of claws and fangs and sinew. From higher portals descended gladiatorial champions on grav harnesses, their silhouettes framed against the haze like dark comets. The crowd's roar became a single shuddering note. Lucius closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He reached inward. Up until now, he had used the stim rack, sparingly, tasting its offerings, measuring their cost. Now he did what no Drukhari would have advised. He traced the control patterns the homunculus had shown him once, during the fitting, a complex sequence meant as a warning, not a suggestion. He triggered every injector at once. The rack's claws clenched into his spine. A storm of chemicals flooded his veins, tearing down the careful balances Fabius and the Coven had so precisely arranged. Stimulants, combat enhancers, nerve exciters, exotic toxins meant to dance on the edge of lethal dosage all surged together, a riot of pharmacology. His heart's hammered so hard, his vision pulsed with each beat. Fire crawled along his nerves, chewing at the old paths and the spider's new ones equally. The world shattered into clarity. There was sound, but it became a distant thrum, a single vast cord hanging over everything. There was light, but it broke into fine threads, each outlining a trajectory, a shift in weight, a flex of muscle. Time did not so much slow as spread, each instant a field of possibilities. He could see, in terrifying detail, every way this could kill him, every edge he might fail to avoid. He laughed. Wyches converged, shrieking. He did not move to meet them. He turned. His first strike was not at a living foe at all, but at the graceful arc of a field generator tower rising from the arena's edge. The faultless blade lashed out, fueled by inhuman speed. Wraithbone split, its inner channels exposed in a spray of shimmering dust and crackling energy. A ripple raced along the invisible barriers, caging the sands, distorting them. The witches faltered, mid-leap. Lucius was already gone, a streak of pale armor and screaming souls. He drove through a cluster of Drukhari handlers stationed at a slave pen's control panel, their weapons half raised in startled reflex. His blade tore through the mechanisms, severing conduits and support struts. The gate securing the penned slaves buckled, hinges twisting, chains snapped. Mortal captives, their bodies marked by 100 small cruelties, surged as one toward the breach. Some died on the still active field, burned to ruin. Others pushed over them, howling, eyes wide with a kind of mad hope. Guards rushed to push them back, only to find Lucius already among them, cutting. The crowd's delight shifted to a different pitch. Confusion edged its hunger. "What is he doing?" voices screamed. "The toy is not playing its part." Elsewhere, other gates opened in time to the plan he had seeded. Cohor's remnants, black shields, legionaries from a dozen broken banners were driven onto the sand to act as secondary amusements. Instead, when their restraints fell away, they did not turn toward Lucius as expected. They turned on their captors. The first sonic blast hit like a thunderclap. The lucid circle had been promised their moment. Their clamps and forced feedback rigs were still in place, but they had learned, through long torment, exactly how to sing through them. They drew breath and let it out as a chord of pure, weaponized sound. The wraithbone underfoot buckled. Hairline cracks spiderwebbed from where they stood, racing across the arena's structures. Drukhari closest to them staggered, clutching at their helmets as the frequencies found soft tissue. Eyes burst. Ears became wells of red. More sonics followed, layered, twisted into discordant harmonies that resonated with particular strengths in Comorit architecture. Pillars juddered, platforms tilted, cages hanging from chains began to swing and then tore loose, tumbling into the pits below. Renegade Astartes, freed into this man-made storm, charged. Cassian led a knot of them up a narrow stair that twisted along the arena wall, heading not for the beasts or the witches, but for the stands themselves. He moved with the grace the spider's modifications had given him, boots finding purchase on surfaces that bucked under sonic assault. They hit the lowest ranks of nobles like a meteor. Armor designed more for display than battle crumpled under mass-reactive rounds. Splendid helms shattered under gauntleted fists. Blood sprayed across silk and gem-encrusted plate. Servitors bearing trays of intoxicants dropped their burdens as chainswords chewed through their chests. Drukhari recoiled, some trying to raise weapons, others too shocked by the reversal to do more than gape. Lucius carved his own path through the core of the arena. He tore down another field generator, its failure sending a visible shimmer across the protective barrier, shielding one section of the crowd. A lucid circle scream hit that weakened patch a moment later, shattering it. Suddenly, those spectators were as exposed as any slave on the sand. Renegade Marines leapt to exploit it. Witch cults, initially delighted by the new flavor of chaos, quickly found themselves under threat from both sides. They spun and whirled, trying to fend off frenzied slaves and vengeful Astartes at once, all while the arena itself crumbled beneath them. Beastmasters lost control of their charges as sonic waves disrupted control nodes. Creatures bred for spectacle broke from their bonds and turned on whatever nearest flesh they could find. The Cabals responded with predictable fury. Reinforcement gates in the arena walls slammed open. Fresh squads of witches poured out, their eyes fever-bright with the promise of an unplanned, more dangerous fight. Incubi followed in their obsidian warplate, claves held at precise angles, each movement a study in lethal discipline. Coven Guard constructs lumbered in, their bodies bristling with syringes and bone blades, their pilots crooning in their nerve-slaved cocoons. The spectacle had become something else. A three-sided massacre blossomed in the collapsing amphitheater. Drukhari killed slaves, gladiators, and even fellow Kabbalite warriors with equal enthusiasm, desperate to assert control. The escaped warriors of chaos and their ragged allies slaughtered anything with Xeno's features. Beasts ran rampant. Homunculi experiments sought new data in emergent conditions. And above it all, the dark city roared, unable to look away. Lucius existed at the heart of it, a fulcrum of motion. The stimrack howled along his spine. The initial flood of chemicals had burned through his system, but he rode the aftershocks, flicking additional doses into his blood when he felt his limbs begin to drag. Each injection was a nail driven deeper into the coffin of his restraint. He cared little. Survival now meant speed, slaughter, and the kind of story that chaos would be unable to ignore. He did not see precisely when Fabius left. He caught glimpses, between cuts and parries, of the primogenitor's balcony. Data slates snatched up, samples, vials of stolen blood perhaps, or fragments of wraithbone etched with readings, swept into cases by quick-handed acolytes. The homunculus that had presided over his stim-fitting conferred with him briefly, their gestures sharp, their amusement undimmed by the carnage. Then Fabius and his retinue were gone. A webway portal irised open behind the balcony, a sliver of impossible light. The spider stepped through without a backward glance, shoulders unbowed, as if leaving an experiment to run to its conclusion. Lucius sensed his absence, like a tooth pulled from a rotten jaw. "Run, then," he snarled to himself as he split an incubus from hip to shoulder. "Scurry back to your station, Spider. See what your notes make of this." He pressed toward the arena's edge. "Cassian," he voxed, signal ragged through the interference of sonic weapons and failing comms. "The Nexus. Now." A grunt of acknowledgement came back, distorted but recognizable. The docking nexus lay beneath the arena, a clustered ring of bays where raider craft and slave barges attached between bouts to disgorge cargo and collect living spoils. Lucius's plan had always hinged on reaching it, on taking something that could survive Komarag's crowded lanes long enough to plunge into the webway's madness. He cut his way to one of the maintenance tunnels, a low artery leading away from the main pit. A handful of cohors brothers and other renegades fell in with him, drawn by instinct and old habits of formation. The lucid circle's soundstorms covered their retreat, the noise marines turning their weaponized grief outward in walls of noise that broke pursuit. The tunnel stank of oil and old blood. Alarms blared, some in human registers, others in frequencies meant only for Drukhari ears. Lumens flickered. In the distance, he heard the stomp and clatter of more coven constructs being redirected. "Faster," he urged, more to himself than to the others. They spilled out into the Nexus. The space was an inverted forest of pylons and docking struts, each cradling a craft of sleek alien design. Slave carriers shaped like barbed thorns, supply barges adorned with screaming faces, smaller raiders with their distinctive sails folded for docking. Tech thralls and lesser Drukhari crew scrambled among them, struggling to answer conflicting orders. Lucius did not give them time to choose a side. He lunged for the nearest suitable vessel, a mid-sized gladiatorial barge whose hull still gleamed with fresh paint. Its prow bore a stylized mask, mouth open in eternal laughter. Chains hung from its underside, some still dripping from recent use. Its engines thrummed on standby, ready for rapid redeployment. "Take that one," he snapped. Cohors and Black Shields crashed into its loading ramp, guns and blades clearing the way. Crew died in their harnesses, some without even drawing weapons, others firing wildly in panic. A Drukhari pilot leapt for an alarm rune and had his arm removed at the elbow by Cassian's blade. Inside, the barge's corridors were cramped compared to the cruiser halls Lucius had known, designed for slender raiders, not transhuman giants. He moved through them with ruthless efficiency, the stim rack lending him the grace to twist and duck where needed, armor grinding along walls in showers of sparks. More crew fell, their blood splashing against knife-edged decor. They reached the command chamber. The Drukhari helmsman spun in his semi-organic cradle, eyes wide. Lucius's sword took him through the midsection, ejecting him from his seat in a flailing of limbs. A Black Shield shoved the twitching corpse aside and tried to make sense of the alien controls. "These systems are not ours," he growled. "The machine spirit is wrong." "Spirits are like men," Lucius said. "They understand fear and violence. Speak to it with those." He slammed his gauntleted hand down on a bank of control runes, feeling for the thrum beneath, for the pulses that meant power and direction. He could not read the glyphs, but he could read response. He gripped the helm struts, muscles flexing, and forced the ship's will toward motion. Somewhere deep within, grav engines spooled up with a rising whine. On the external hull, docking clamps fought to hold. Alarm glyphs flashed across the nexus as safety interlocks engaged and tried to override the manual launch. Lucius bared his teeth, feeling the stim rack's claws rake his spine. "Burn," he whispered to the engines. A gout of power surged through the vessel. Docking struts tore free with shrieks of stressed metal and offended wraithbone. The gladiatorial barge lurched, its prow swinging wild. It collided with a neighboring raider, scraping along its flank, sending Drukhari and slaves tumbling from boarding ramps into the void between. Fire blossomed along both hulls as reactive fields clashed. They burst out of the nexus and into Comarag's transit lanes, like a lunatic thrown into a crowded street. Traffic scattered. Raider skiffs and skyboards peeled away, their riders cursing wrathfully over comms. Larger barges swerved, some colliding with one another, others clipping the edges of the arena satellite. Structures anchored to the city's greater mass groaned as the stolen vessel's wild course dragged against connection points. "Direction?" Cassian shouted over the din, bracing himself in the command chamber as the ship rolled. "The webway," Lucius said. "Any aperture you can find that does not scream instant obliteration. Failing that, an aperture that screams less loudly than the others." Black Shield and cohors alike bent their will toward the alien systems. They bullied levers and rune banks into cooperation, forcing the barge through turns it had never been meant to take. It became an ungainly spear, trailing sparks and debris as it rammed through lesser craft, shearing off observation balconies, ripping through decorative arcs that connected spires. Comarag itself began to respond. Gun platforms spat lances of captured energy. Webs of grav snare fields flickered into being, trying to catch the rogue vessel in their nets. Pain engines launched themselves from coven docks, drawn by the promise of fresh and interesting screams. Somewhere, an Archon screamed orders that rippled through the city like shockwaves. Lucius felt the ship shudder under each new impact. "Now!" he hissed through clenched teeth, leaning on the helm as if he could physically force the barge along the vector he desired. "Now, show me the door." The webway answered. A rent in reality yawned ahead, not as controlled or neat as the portals used for regular traffic, but wide enough. Light spilled from it in colors that defied simple description, flowing across the barge's hull like liquid madness. The stolen vessel plunged toward it, trailing wreckage. For a heartbeat, Lucius thought they would miss. that they would clip the edge and be sheared apart. He flared the engines with a last savage push, feeling something vital in the machine's spirit crack under the strain. They hit the threshold and fell through. The transition ripped a snarl from him. This was not the crude emptiness of real space, or the familiar howling injustice of the warp. The webway's pressure was stranger, a sideways force that tried to peel ship and crew apart in planes they were not designed to occupy. The barge screamed, metal and grown bone twisting. Then they were through, tumbling along a half-solid corridor of fractured geometries. The journey through that labyrinth could not be measured in conventional units. It was a series of lurches, of sudden voids and compressions, of glimpses of other tunnels filled with other horrors. Twice, something vast and insectile brushed against the vessel, leaving cracks in the hull that glowed from within. Once, for a breath, Lucius thought he saw a distant city of stranger design than Comora, its structures grown rather than built. At last, the barge spat itself back into the honest cold of real space with a convulsive shudder. Silence fell, alarms still bleated, fires still burned in places, atmosphere vented through ragged rents until emergency seals finally responded with sluggish diligence. The stars beyond the viewport were unfamiliar, but that meant little. Any point outside the webway and away from the dark city was victory enough for the moment. Lucius stepped away from the helm. His limbs felt heavy now that the stim rack's initial fury had faded. Every nerve ached. His heart beat in faltering syncopation, struggling to find a normal rhythm after being forced to sprint for so long. He could smell his own blood inside the helm, copper and something harsher, tainted by alien chem traces. He made his way to the main hold. The corridors were a charnel house. Drukhari bodies lay where they had fallen, their elegant armor dented and stained. Some had died in the assault on the Nexus, others during the wild flight. Flung against walls with bone-snapping force, the renegades had not bothered to tidy. The hold itself was lit by flickering lumen strips, some already burned out, others stuttering. Smoke hung thick, threaded with the stench of promethium and scorched alien materials. The floor was slick, where fluids had pooled and then dried. They gathered there, the survivors. Cohor's Nasique remnants, their Third Legion heraldry scoured by centuries, yet still discernible beneath newer scars. Black shields, plates painted in hastily adopted schemes, symbols scratched on in defiance of lost pasts. Noise marines of the Lucid Circle, still twitching faintly as their weaponry cycled down from the heights it had reached during the escape. Others too, nameless renegades from shattered warbands, sons of legions whose banners had long since been burned, all united now by one simple fact. They had stood in a Drukhari arena, and not only survived, but left. They looked to Lucius. He stood among them, helm off, face a ruin of old and new scars. The stim rack loomed over his shoulders, its injector spines glistening in the low light, ampules chiming softly as the vessel vibrated. He felt the moment as a knot in the air, a pulled thread in the weave of events. He could ignore it, let them drift apart into piracy and madness, or he could seize it and cut. He drew a knife, an ordinary thing by his standards, stolen from a Drukhari belt. Its edge was keen enough. He turned it in his hand, thinking not of the spider's precise incisions, but of the rough, meaningful cuts of older rituals. "You were broken," he said, voice carrying easily in the hush. "We all were. Cohor's Nasique, Lucid Circle, Black Shields, scattered sons of a dead crusade. The Dark City took us as separate trophies. It used us as toys. It thought that would be the end of us." He looked around, meeting gaze after gaze. It was wrong. He drew the blade across his palm, opening flesh. Blood welled, dark in, the half-light dripping to the deck. "In Comarach," he went on, "they tried to strip us, of names, of legions, of meaning. They made us fight as their playthings. They hung us in cages and nailed us to walls. They fed us to beasts and blades and believed that made us theirs. He closed his fist, blood pattering. But we are still here. He stepped to Cassian first, reaching out without asking and scoring a matching cut along the veteran's palm. The older warrior did not flinch. "We have suffered," Lucius said. "We have died and risen, in body or in soul. We have been refined in a pit that would have broken lesser men. Whatever weakness clung to us before we fell into the dark city has burned away." He moved among them, marking palms, drawing lines of red on ceramite and flesh. Some of the noise marines laughed as he cut them, their nerves too fried to distinguish one pain from another. Others bowed their heads, taking the mark with a solemnity that had not sat on their faces in centuries. "We are not Cohors Nasicae alone any longer," he said. "We are not Lucid Circle alone. We are not nameless renegades thrown together by chance. We have been tempered by the same fire, hammered on the same anvil. We are one warband now, bound by atrocity and by choice." He returned to the center of the hold. "We will be called the Faultless," he said softly, "not because we are perfect. That myth died with Chemos and with Terra's walls, but because every flaw has been cut from us in suffering, because every weakness has been driven out in chains and in arenas, because what remains is a blade that has survived the worst the galaxy's cruelest city could offer and still cuts." Faces turned to one another, searching, weighing. Old loyalties tried to rise, then faltered. New patterns formed in the spaces between them. "Say it," Lucius urged. Cassian spoke first. "We are the Faultless," he said, voice rough. Others took it up. "We are the Faultless," the Black Shield rasped. "We are the Faultless," the Lucid Circle hissed through damaged Vox units, their tones adding an eerie harmony. The words spread, echoing from scarred throats and broken helm speakers, filling the hold with a new name that tasted of blood and defiance. Lucius felt his curse stir at the sound, as if approving. The faces in his armor shifted, their shrieks rising to a new pitch. The stim rack purred along his spine, eager for the next battle. He turned toward the nearest view slit. Beyond, the void waited, indifferent. Somewhere out there, the Imperium still clung to its hollow creed, its armies marching and dying. Somewhere, Fabius Bile sat in his station of corpses and notes, poring over data harvested from Comorra's grand experiment. Somewhere, the Phoenician brooded on his own throne, his mirror cracked, his legions scattered and twisted. Lucius lifted his bloodied hand and pressed it against the pane. "We come," he whispered. "We come as a new cutting edge." He strode back toward the command chamber. "Set course for the warp," he ordered. "Any direction will do. The gods will see us coming. They will send us foes. They always do." The Black Shield at the alien helm nodded, hands moving with growing confidence over the hateful controls. Engines rumbled, patch systems flared. The stolen vessel turned its prow toward nothing in particular and everything at once. As the faultless warband's ship limped toward the first warp breach it could tear open, Lucius felt the stim rack's injectors twitch like hungry teeth. He smiled. "Twin betrayals," he mused aloud. "The gods and the Xenos, the spider and the city. All of them thought they were shaping me." He laughed, low and genuine. "They were," he said. "They just have not yet understood for whose hand the blade was truly being made." The warp opened before them, a wound in the skin of reality, vast and churning. The vessel slid toward it, sirens wailing, hull still stained with alien blood and the marks of the dark city. Lucius stood at the prow as the void tore. The souls in his armor screamed in savage joy. The stim rack hissed softly along his spine, promising future excess. The faultless warband roared their defiance to a universe that could not hear and would not care. They vanished into the madness, a new shard of chaos hurled outward, eager to test its edge on gods and mortals alike.